I imagine a world emerging slowly from shadow, a time when the light fell differently across the land, when the rhythm of days moved to the turning of seasons and the tolling of bells that echoed across valleys still thick with ancient forest. Medieval Europe, a phrase that conjures something distant, something half-remembered, like a dream that lingers just beyond the edge of waking thought. But it was real as stone and earth and the hands that shaped them, as real as the breath of millions who lived and loved and labored beneath skies we would scarcely recognize. The air smells different here, wood smoke curling from 1,000 hearths, the rich dark scent of turned earth in fields that stretch beyond sight, and something else, something harder to name, the mineral tang of quarried stone, the sweet decay of thatch, the intermingling of animals and humans in spaces far more intimate than we might imagine today. I find myself standing at the edge of a village, though village feels too simple a word for what unfolds before me, a cluster of structures that seem to grow from the land itself, timber and daub and wattle woven together with a craft passed down through generations who never wrote their names, who left no grand monuments, but whose hands shaped every beam and post with patient knowing. The great church rises at the center, not yet the soaring cathedral of later centuries, but solid, present, its thick walls bearing the weight of more than timber and stone, bearing the weight of community and memory and something approaching forever in the minds of those who built it, who would never see its completion, but trusted that their children and their children's children would continue the work. Time moved differently then, or perhaps it's only that we move differently now, rushing, always rushing, while here in this other world, this medieval landscape, there is a quality of patience woven into the very fabric of existence, the patience of the mason who carves a single stone for days, knowing it will fit with 1,000 others he will never touch, the patience of the scribe who copies manuscripts by candlelight, preserving words in languages both living and slowly dying, the patience of the farmer who tends the same strips of land his grandfather tended, trusting the old rotations, the fallow years that let the earth breathe and recover. The light here has a particular quality, softer somehow, filtering through air thick with moisture from endless forests and wetlands not yet drained, through smoke from fires that never fully die, banked each night and coaxed to life each morning, a continuity of flame that connects one day to the next in an unbroken thread. I notice the sounds, or rather the absence of sounds we take for granted. No mechanical hum, no distant traffic, no electrical buzz. Instead, the low of cattle being driven to common pasture, the rhythmic strike of a blacksmith's hammer on anvil, the call of a woman selling bread in the market square, voices rising in plain chant from the church, a weaving of human and animal and natural sound that creates its own kind of music. The world is smaller here, and yet somehow larger, smaller because most people will never travel more than a day's walk from where they were born, because news arrives slowly, carried by travelers and merchants and the occasional herald, because the known world extends only as far as rumor and imagination, and yet larger because each place contains multitudes, because a single manor or monastery might hold all the complexity of the governance and craft and spiritual yearning that we now scatter across cities. I think of the 1,000 years we call medieval, though those who lived them, who knew no such name. They did not think of themselves as a middle or between. They were simply present, living in what they understood as the fullness of time, in a world that had always been and would always be, or so it seemed until the slow accumulation of changes, barely perceptible in a single lifetime, began to shift the very foundations of how humans organized themselves and understood their place in creation, from the ruins of Rome's Western Empire, from the migrations and settlements and slow blendings of peoples, from the spread of Christian monasticism and the adaptation of older traditions. Something new took shape, something we can only see clearly from this great distance, something that seemed eternal to those within it, and yet was always, always in the process of becoming. The evening draws closer, the light growing thicker, more golden, and I find myself drawn deeper into this landscape, ready to wander through the centuries that stretch ahead, through the kingdoms and villages and monasteries, through the minds and hearts of people who seem so distant, and yet, in their fundamental humanness, in their capacity for wonder and cruelty and tenderness and fear, are perhaps not so different from those who would come after. The story begins not with a single moment, but with a slow unraveling, the gradual dissolution of an empire that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Rome, that word which had meant order and roads and law stretching from Britain to the deserts of Africa, began to contract, to pull back, like a tide that would never return. In the year 410, a date that would echo through centuries, the Visigoths entered Rome, not as visitors or supplicants, but as conquerors. And though the city had long since ceased to be the true center of imperial power, the symbolic weight of this moment rippled outward, a signal that the old certainties were crumbling, that the world was entering a time of transformation so profound that those living through it could scarcely comprehend the magnitude of change. But the end of Rome was not the end of everything. This is crucial to understand. The people did not vanish. The knowledge did not simply disappear into darkness. Instead, a long, slow process of adaptation began. A blending of Roman provincial culture with the customs and structures of the Germanic peoples who had been moving, settling, integrating themselves into the fabric of the empire for generations. In Gaul, in Hispania, in Britain, and along the Rhine and Danube, new kingdoms emerged, led by warriors who had served in Roman armies, who had learned Latin and adopted Roman titles, who married into Roman families and converted to Christianity, creating something hybrid, something that carried forward elements of the old world, even as it forged new patterns of authority and belonging. The Frankish kingdoms rose in what had been Gaul, built by the Merovingian dynasty, whose origins blend history and legend in equal measure. King Clovis, whose name we might render as Louis in later centuries, united the Frankish tribes in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, and his conversion to Catholic Christianity, rather than the Arian Christianity of many Germanic peoples, created an alliance between Frankish military power and the Roman ecclesiastical structure that would shape the future of Western Europe. The Church became the vessel that carried Roman learning forward. Monasteries scattered across the landscape like islands of literacy in a world where reading and writing were becoming rare and specialized skills. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved texts, maintained the calendar, kept records, and in doing so, created networks of knowledge and communication that transcended the fragmentary political boundaries of the early medieval world. In Italy, the situation grew more complex still. The Ostrogoths established a kingdom that tried to maintain Roman administrative structures, their king Theodoric ruling from Ravenna, attempting to balance Gothic military culture with Roman civilian governance, but this fragile arrangement collapsed in the mid-6th century when the Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of Rome that had never fallen, launched a campaign to reconquer the West. The Gothic wars that followed devastated the Italian peninsula, decades of fighting that left cities depopulated, aqueducts broken, the countryside ravaged, and when the Byzantines finally achieved a hollow victory, they lacked the resources to truly restore what had been lost. And within a generation, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, swept down from the north, establishing their own kingdom in northern and central Italy, fragmenting the peninsula into a patchwork that would persist for over 1,000 years. Britain followed its own trajectory, more isolated, more completely severed from the Mediterranean world. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged there after the Roman withdrawal developed with less direct continuity from the Roman past, their language and culture drawing more heavily from their Germanic roots, though Christianity would eventually arrive, brought by missionaries from both Rome and the Celtic monasteries of Ireland, creating new connections to the broader Christian world. In Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom established itself, eventually converting from Arian to Catholic Christianity in the late 6th century, creating a realm that blended Roman law and Gothic military tradition, a kingdom that seemed stable and enduring until the early 8th century would bring dramatic and unexpected transformation. Ireland, never conquered by Rome, developed its own distinctive form of medieval culture, Celtic Christianity flowering in monasteries that became centers of learning and artistry, producing illuminated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, sending missionaries back to Britain and across to the continent, contributing to the gradual Christianization and cultural development of the post-Roman world. The 7th century brought new challenges and new energies. In the Arabian Peninsula, a religious and political movement erupted that would reshape the Mediterranean world. Islam, spreading with remarkable speed through the Middle East, across North Africa, and in 711, across the Straits of Gibraltar into Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed in a matter of years, and a new reality emerged, Al-Andalus, a Muslim polity in Western Europe that would become a center of learning and culture, while Christian kingdoms persisted in the mountainous north, beginning the long, slow process of the Reconquista that would take centuries to complete. The arrival of Islam in the Western Mediterranean transformed trade patterns, cultural exchanges, and the political landscape. It also contributed to a drawing apart of the Mediterranean world. The sea that had been Rome's Mare Nostrum, our sea, became a frontier, a border between realms that would have limited but significant contact, exchanges of goods and ideas, and occasionally hostilities, but no longer the unified space it had been. In the Frankish kingdoms, a new dynasty rose to power, the Carolingians, who began as mayors of the palace, administrators for increasingly weak Merovingian kings, until finally, in 751, Pepin the Short claimed the throne with papal blessing, creating a new alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy that would define much of medieval European politics. Pepin's son would be remembered as Charles the Great, Charlemagne, who in the late 8th and early 9th centuries created an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to Rome, a realm larger than any in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. He was crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800, a symbolic moment that attempted to revive the idea of a Christian Roman Empire in the West, though the reality was something quite different from what Rome had been. The Carolingian Renaissance brought renewed attention to learning, to classical texts, to education. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe to his court, mandated the establishment of schools, standardized religious practice, encouraged the copying of manuscripts in a new clear script, Carolingian minuscule, that would influence European handwriting for centuries. This was not a restoration of classical culture, but an adaptation, a Christian reworking of selected elements of the Roman past. The monasteries expanded their role during this period, becoming not just centers of prayer and manuscript production, but also agricultural innovators, managing vast estates, developing new techniques for cultivation and animal husbandry, creating surplus that supported not just the monastic communities themselves, but also schools and hospitals and charity for the poor. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, became the dominant framework for monastic life in Western Europe. Its carefully balanced schedule of prayer and work and study, its moderate approach to asceticism, its emphasis on stability and obedience and community, created institutions that could endure across generations, that could accumulate wealth and knowledge and influence. But the Carolingian Empire could not hold. The centrifugal forces were too strong, the administrative structures too weak, the custom of dividing realms among sons too deeply ingrained, and after Charlemagne's death, and the brief reign of his son Louis the Pious, the empire fractured, divided by the Treaty of Verdun in 843 into 3 kingdoms that roughly prefigured the later divisions between France and Germany and Italy, though the boundaries would shift endlessly in the centuries to come. The 9th and 10th centuries brought new waves of invasion and disruption. From the north, the Vikings, Norse seafarers and raiders who struck with devastating speed, their shallow draft ships allowing them to penetrate deep into river systems, raiding monasteries and towns, eventually settling and establishing their own territories, the Danelaw in England, Normandy in Francia, creating new cultural blendings and political arrangements. From the east, the Magyars, mounted warriors from the steppes, raided deep into Central Europe and Italy until finally defeated and converted to Christianity, establishing the Kingdom of Hungary, another addition to the complex mosaic of medieval European polities. From the south, Saracen raiders from North Africa struck at coastal settlements in Italy and southern Francia, creating insecurity that pushed settlement inland, that encouraged the building of fortifications, the development of local defense structures that would contribute to the fragmentation of political authority. These invasions, these disruptions, accelerated changes that were already underway, the breakdown of centralized authority, the rise of local strongmen who could offer protection in exchange for service and loyalty, the development of what later scholars would call feudalism, though that word itself is contested, a shorthand for complex and variable arrangements of land tenure and military obligation and personal bonds that differed significantly from place to place and time to time. The castle began to appear across the landscape, at first simple wooden structures on earthen mounds, motte and bailey fortifications that could be erected quickly, later evolving into more permanent stone structures. These were not just military installations, they were centers of lordship, symbols of authority, residences from which local lords administered justice and collected rents and organized the labor of the surrounding countryside. The year 1000 approached, and though apocalyptic fears were likely less widespread than later legends would suggest, there was nevertheless a sense of time deepening, of the world acquiring age and weight. The early medieval period, the age of migrations and invasions and fragmentation, was giving way to something new, to a period of relative stability and growth, to a flourishing of culture and economy and political organization that would characterize the high medieval period. But that transformation, that flowering, belongs to another chapter of this long, slow story. The 11th century dawned with a new energy, a quickening of life that manifested in stone and parchment and the steady expansion of cultivated land. The population was growing, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, and with this growth came new possibilities, new complexities, new forms of organization that would define what historians call the High Middle Ages. The landscape itself was being transformed. Forests that had stood since time immemorial fell to the axe. Marshes were drained. New villages appeared in clearings. The great work of internal colonization as people pushed into marginal lands, bringing them under cultivation, extending the reach of human settlement and agriculture into spaces that had been wild. This was not conquest in the military sense, but a slower, more patient kind of expansion, the conquest of nature through labor. The technology of farming evolved, the heavy plow with its iron blade and wheels, capable of turning the dense soils of northern Europe, became more widespread. The three-field system replaced older two-field rotations in many regions, allowing more intensive use of the land. One field in winter grain, one in spring grain, one lying fallow, a rhythm that increased yields and supported larger populations. The horse collar, a seemingly simple innovation, transformed agricultural labor, allowing horses to pull plows and carts without the choking effect of older harness designs. Horses were faster than oxen, could work longer hours, and their use spread gradually across the countryside, changing the pace and productivity of rural life. Mills multiplied along rivers and streams, water wheels turning grinding stones, converting grain to flour with mechanical power rather than human muscle. These mills became markers of lordship, monopolies that peasants were required to use, paying fees that enriched the lords who controlled them. But they also represented a harnessing of natural forces, an application of engineering knowledge that increased efficiency and freed human labor for other tasks. The monasteries continued their expansion. New orders emerged, each with its own interpretation of how the religious life should be lived. The Cluniacs emphasized elaborate liturgy and independence from local secular control, their mother house at Cluny becoming the center of a network of dependent priories that stretched across Europe. Their church rebuilt in the late 11th century to be the largest in Christendom, a statement of spiritual ambition rendered in stone. The Cistercians represented a different vision, a return to stricter observance of the Benedictine rule. They sought out remote locations, cleared land, built their austere churches without decoration or ornament, developed expertise in agriculture and especially sheep farming, their white-robed monks becoming masters of estate management, creating economic enterprises that accumulated vast wealth even as they preached poverty and simplicity. Towns began to grow. Old Roman settlements reawakened. New market centers emerged at crossroads and river crossings. These were not yet the great cities of later centuries, but their appearance marked a significant shift, a revival of urban life in regions where it had nearly disappeared. Walls went up. Guilds formed. Merchants and artisans organized themselves into communities with their own customs and privileges, negotiating charters from lords and kings that granted them degrees of self-governance. The growth of towns created new social categories, people who were neither nobles nor peasants nor clergy, burghers, townspeople whose wealth came from trade and craft rather than land, whose loyalty was to their community rather than to a personal lord. This unsettled older categories created tensions and opportunities, added new layers to the social fabric. Trade expanded along rivers and roads and sea routes. The Mediterranean came alive with Italian merchants, Venice and Genoa and Pisa competing for dominance, establishing trading posts in the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states, bringing Eastern goods, spices and silk and precious metals to Western markets, growing wealthy on the margins of exchange. In the north, the Baltic, that became a zone of intensive commerce. German merchants formed the Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading cities that dominated commerce from Novgorod to London, their cogs, sturdy sailing ships with high sides, carried timber and furs and amber and grain, linking the northern world in networks of exchange. The fairs of Champagne became meeting points where northern and southern trade routes intersected. Merchants from across Europe gathered at designated times and places, exchanging goods, settling accounts, developing the financial instruments, letters of credit and bills of exchange that allowed commerce to operate across great distances without the need to transport heavy coins. The castle evolved from simple wooden structures to elaborate stone fortifications. The Norman keep, square and solid, rising multiple stories with thick walls and small windows, designed to withstand siege. These were expensive to build, requiring skilled masons and years of labor. Their presence on the landscape declared the power and permanence of those who built them. The cathedral became the defining architectural achievement of the age. The Romanesque style of the 11th and early 12th centuries, with its round arches and massive pillars and barrel vaults, created spaces of profound solidity, churches that seemed to anchor earth to heaven through sheer weight of stone. Durham, Spire, Santiago de Compostela, each a masterwork of engineering and devotion. Then, in the mid-12th century, a new style emerged from the Ile-de-France, what later ages would call Gothic, pointed arches and ribbed vaults and flying buttresses, innovations that allowed walls to rise higher and thinner, that permitted the insertion of vast windows filled with colored glass, transforming the interior into spaces of colored light. Abbot Suger at Saint-Denis articulated a theology of light, the divine made manifest through radiance and beauty, and this vision spread. Chartres, Notre-Dame de Paris, Amiens, Cologne, Salisbury, each pushing the limits of what stone and glass could achieve. These cathedrals took generations to complete, entire lifetimes spent cutting stone and laying foundations, carving capitals and corbels, mixing mortar and hoisting blocks into place. The names of most workers are lost to us, anonymous craftsmen whose skill created beauty that would endure for centuries. But the buildings themselves stand as testimony to their mastery, to the patient accumulation of knowledge about structure and proportion, and the behavior of materials under stress. The universities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. Communities of masters and students organized to pursue learning, initially focused on theology and law and medicine and the liberal arts, the 7 traditional disciplines inherited from antiquity: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, the foundation of medieval education, the recovery of Aristotle's works, transmitted through Arabic translations and commentaries, revolutionized medieval thought. Suddenly there was access to a comprehensive philosophical system, a way of understanding the natural world through reason and observation. This created both opportunity and crisis. How to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology? How to integrate pagan learning with revealed truth? Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century attempted a grand synthesis, the Summa Theologicae, an encyclopedic work that engaged with every major theological and philosophical question, using Aristotelian methods to elaborate and defend Christian doctrine, creating an intellectual edifice as ambitious in its own way as the Gothic cathedrals were in theirs. The scholastic method dominated university education. Formal disputations where questions were posed, arguments and counter-arguments presented, authorities cited, distinctions drawn. This could seem dry and overly subtle to later critics, but it represented a serious effort to think systematically, to test ideas through rigorous questioning, to build knowledge through careful reasoning. The Crusades shaped this period profoundly. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The response exceeded all expectations. Thousands took the cross, motivated by piety and hope for salvation, by dreams of adventure and land, by poverty and desperation. The First Crusade succeeded against considerable odds, establishing crusader states in the Levant that would persist for nearly 2 centuries. Subsequent crusades had mixed results. Some ended in disaster. The Fourth Crusade infamously diverted to Constantinople, sacking the Christian Byzantine capital in 1204, a catastrophe that deepened the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity and fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire. But the crusading movement persisted, becoming a permanent feature of European culture, shaping ideas about holy war and religious identity, about the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The Crusades also facilitated cultural exchange. European knights and merchants spent time in the East, encountered different technologies and ideas, returned with new tastes for sugar and cotton and architectural innovations. This was not peaceful exchange. It occurred in the context of warfare and conquest, but it nevertheless contributed to the transmission of knowledge and techniques between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. The Reconquista in Iberia continued throughout this period, Christian kingdoms slowly expanding southward, capturing Toledo in 1085, a major symbolic and practical victory that brought Arabic manuscripts and Jewish scholars into the Christian world, creating conditions for translation movements that made Greek and Arabic learning available in Latin. Spain became a crucial zone of contact and transmission, where the three Abrahamic faiths coexisted uneasily, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in conflict, always in complex relationship. The Jewish communities scattered across medieval Europe occupied a distinctive position. Excluded from many occupations, barred from owning land in most places, they often specialized in commerce and money lending, activities that Christian teaching complicated for Christians themselves. This made them valuable to rulers who needed financial services, but also vulnerable to persecution and scapegoating, especially during times of crisis or religious fervor. The 12th century witnessed a flowering of Jewish scholarship, rabbinical academies in the Rhineland and Spain and southern France produced commentaries and legal texts and philosophy. Maimonides, physician and philosopher, attempted his own synthesis of Aristotelian thought and Jewish theology, creating works that influenced Christian and Islamic thinkers as well as Jewish ones. Women in this medieval world occupied complex positions. Legal status varied by region and social class. Noble women could wield considerable power, managing estates in their husband's absence, arranging marriages, patronizing religious foundations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was Queen of France and then England, participated directly in politics and governance, supporting her sons in rebellion against her husband, riding on crusade, living to see her grandchildren positioned across the thrones of Europe. Peasant women worked alongside men in fields and gardens, managed households, performed the endless labor of food preparation and textile production, spinning and weaving and sewing that clothed their families and generated surplus for trade or rent. Their work was essential, though rarely recorded, their names mostly lost, except in scattered manor records and court rolls. Religious women found space for autonomy in convents and nunneries. Abbesses governed their own communities, managed properties, exercised spiritual authority. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote theology and natural philosophy, composed music, corresponded with popes and emperors, carved out space for female intellectual and creative life within structures that generally subordinated women to male authority. The 13th century represented perhaps the apex of medieval civilization. The population reached levels it would not attain again until the modern era. Agricultural production was high. Trade networks functioned efficiently. The universities flourished. The great cathedrals neared completion. Powerful monarchies in France and England developed increasingly sophisticated administrative systems. The papacy exercised extensive authority over the church and claimed supremacy over secular rulers. It seemed as though this world had achieved a kind of equilibrium, a stable order that might endure indefinitely, but already, in ways not yet visible, the seeds of transformation were present, waiting for conditions that would allow them to germinate. The 14th century opened with signs of strain. The climate was shifting, imperceptibly at first, but with cumulative effect. The medieval warm period that had allowed cultivation of marginal lands and supported population growth was giving way to cooler, wetter conditions. Harvests failed more frequently. Famines struck with devastating regularity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed perhaps 10% of the population in Northern Europe, a catastrophe that revealed the fragility underlying apparent prosperity. The population had reached the limits of what medieval agricultural technology could support. Too many people on land that was increasingly exhausted, forests cleared too completely, soils depleted by centuries of cultivation without adequate fertilization. The expansion that had characterized the previous centuries slowed, stopped, began to reverse. Villages were abandoned, marginal lands reverted to wilderness. The great internal colonization was over. Political tensions escalated. The 100 Years' War began in 1337, a dynastic conflict between England and France that would drag on intermittently for over a century, devastating the French countryside, draining treasuries, killing nobles and peasants alike in battles and sieges and the brutal chevauchée, the mounted raids that burned villages and destroyed crops to undermine enemy resources. The nature of warfare was changing. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen slaughtered French cavalry. Repeating the performance at Poitiers a decade later, the flower of French chivalry, knights who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat fell to commoners armed with simple wooden bows. This was more than military defeat. It was symbolic, suggesting that the old order, the dominance of the mounted warrior, might not be as secure as it seemed. Then came the pestilence. In 1347, reports began to filter westward from the Black Sea. A terrible disease was spreading, killing with horrifying speed and completeness. By 1348, it had reached Italy. By 1349, it was in England and Scandinavia. The Black Death, likely bubonic plague, though some historians debate the precise pathogen, killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the space of a few years. The scale of death defied comprehension. Entire villages disappeared. Monasteries lost all their inhabitants. Cities became charnel houses. The living could barely bury the dead. Mass graves, bodies stacked in layers. The social fabric tore under the strain. Some turned to frantic piety, flagellants whipping themselves in public processions, seeking to appease divine wrath, others to scapegoating, pogroms against Jewish communities accused of poisoning wells, massacres that revealed the depths of hatred and fear. The plague returned in waves throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, never again with the catastrophic mortality of the first outbreak, but sufficient to prevent population recovery, to maintain a demographic depression that fundamentally altered the economic and social landscape. Labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants could demand better terms, higher wages, more freedom. Lords who had depended on abundant cheap labor found their authority challenged. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw tens of thousands march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the repeal of oppressive laws. They were ultimately defeated, their leaders executed, but the underlying economic forces could not be reversed by violence. Serfdom gradually weakened, commuted to money rents, as lords found it more practical to hire free laborers than to compel service from legally bound peasants. The church faced its own crisis of authority. The papacy had moved to Avignon in 1309, remaining there for nearly 70 years under French influence when it finally returned to Rome. A disputed papal election in 1378 resulted in rival popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming legitimacy, each excommunicating the other's supporters. The Great Schism persisted for decades, resolved only by the Council of Constance in the early 15th century. But the damage to papal prestige was profound and lasting. Critics of the Church grew bolder. John Wycliffe in England questioned papal authority, argued for scripture in the vernacular, challenged transubstantiation. His followers, the Lollards, persisted despite persecution in Bohemia. Jan Hus drew on Wycliffe's ideas, adding his own critique of church wealth and corruption. He was burned as a heretic in 1415, but his movement sparked wars that ravaged Central Europe for decades. These were harbingers of the Protestant Reformation that would come a century later. Yet even as the 14th century brought crisis and death, it also saw remarkable cultural achievements. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, creating Italian literature as a serious artistic medium. Petrarch and Boccaccio followed, developing new forms and styles that influenced writers across Europe. The vernacular languages were coming into their own, no longer merely spoken dialects, but vehicles for sophisticated literary expression. In painting, Giotto broke with the flat, stylized figures of medieval art, creating forms with weight and volume, placing them in convincing spatial settings. His frescoes in Padua and Florence suggested a new way of seeing, of representing the world with attention to naturalistic detail and human emotion. This was not yet the full flowering of Renaissance art, but the seeds were being planted. The universities continued to function, though sometimes disrupted by plague or war. New institutions were founded, Prague in 1348, Heidelberg in 1386, a proliferation of centers of learning across Europe. The curriculum remained traditional, but within that framework, debates continued about free will and determinism, about the nature of universals, about logic and language and how knowledge is possible. Technological innovation continued. Mechanical clocks began to appear in churches and town squares in the 14th century, marking hours with mechanical precision rather than the approximate divisions of the day, based on bells and sun position. This seems minor, but it represented a shift in consciousness, a new way of experiencing time as something measurable, divisible, commodifiable. Gunpowder arrived from China by the 14th century. Cannon were being used in sieges, primitive at first, dangerous to operators, but steadily improving. By the 15th century, artillery could breach walls that had been impregnable to traditional siege weapons. The great castles and fortifications of the medieval period became obsolete, requiring complete reimagining of defensive architecture. Bastions and angular walls designed to deflect cannon shot rather than high curtain walls meant to resist ladders and siege towers. The printing press arrived in the mid-15th century. Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, developing movable type that made possible the relatively rapid production of books. The first major work was a Bible, printed in the 1450s. Beautiful enough to compete with manuscript books, but producible in quantities that would have required an army of scribes. Within decades, printing presses spread across Europe, and the cost of books began to fall, slowly making reading material accessible to broader audiences. The 100 Years' War finally ground to a close in the mid-15th century. France ultimately victorious. England expelled from all continental possessions except Calais, but immediately England descended into its own civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses, noble factions fighting for the throne, eliminating each other with remarkable thoroughness, until finally Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485, establishing a new dynasty. The medieval period in England was effectively over, though no one at the time would have used that term. The Byzantine Empire, that eastern remnant of Rome that had survived while the West fragmented, finally fell in 1453. Constantinople captured by the Ottoman Turks after a siege that saw the last use of Greek fire and the first major deployment of a massive siege cannon. The great walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years were breached. The emperor died fighting in the streets, and a direct link to the ancient world was severed. Greek scholars fled west, bringing manuscripts and knowledge, contributing to the revival of classical learning that was already underway in Italy. The Italian Renaissance was in full flower by the 15th century, though Renaissance itself is a later construction. Those living through it experienced it as a revival, a rebirth of ancient excellence. Brunelleschi studying Roman buildings to understand dome construction, creating the great cupola of Florence Cathedral, Donatello sculpting figures that seemed alive, standing with classical contrapposto, Botticelli, painting mythological subjects with a grace and beauty that drew on both classical and Christian traditions. Humanism as an intellectual movement emphasized the study of classical texts, grammar and rhetoric and moral philosophy, the studia humanitatis. This was not a rejection of Christianity, but a different emphasis, attention to this world and human achievement alongside concern for salvation. Many humanists were devout, but their devotion expressed itself differently than the scholastic theology of the universities, more literary, more concerned with eloquence and moral example than with logical demonstration. The voyages of exploration began. Portuguese navigators pushing down the African coast, seeking a sea route to the spices of the East. By 1488, Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope a decade later. Vasco da Gama reached India, establishing direct maritime trade that bypassed the Mediterranean intermediaries who had dominated the spice trade, and in 1492, Columbus sailing for Spain, seeking a western route to Asia, instead encountered the Americas, a discovery that would transform the world in ways no one could have anticipated. These voyages were made possible by medieval innovations, the compass, improved ship designs, better maps and navigational techniques, knowledge accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean and Baltic sailing, applied now to oceanic voyages, pushing beyond the known world into seas that medieval maps had left blank or filled with monsters and speculation. The medieval world was not ending all at once. No trumpet sounded to mark its passing, but the 15th century saw a convergence of changes, demographic, economic, technological, cultural, political, that together constitute a profound transformation. The structures and assumptions that had organized European life for centuries were being challenged, modified, sometimes abandoned. New possibilities emerged, new ways of organizing society, new forms of knowledge and expression, new connections across previously unimaginable distances. Standing at the end of the 15th century, looking back across the medieval millennium, the journey seems immense, from the ruins of Rome to the threshold of a global expansion, from manuscript culture to print, from fragmented kingdoms to emerging nation-states, from Romanesque solidity to Gothic transcendence to Renaissance humanism, 1,000 years of human striving, of faith and doubt, of beauty and brutality, of patient craft and sudden violence, of continuity and change braided together in patterns that still shape the world we inhabit. And yet, beneath the grand movements of kingdoms and churches and plagues, beneath the rise and fall of dynasties and the construction of cathedrals, there were the lives, countless individual lives, each one a universe of experience and feeling. Peasants who never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, who nevertheless knew the intricacies of their land with an intimacy we can barely imagine, who could read weather in the behavior of birds and clouds, who understood the rhythms of growth and decay with a knowledge earned through generations of observation. There were the craftsmen, the carpenters, who could judge timber by touch and smell, who knew which trees grew straight and which would warp, who understood the language of grain and knot, the potters who centered clay on wheels turned by foot, whose hands remembered forms passed down through apprenticeship, muscle memory that connected them to makers stretching back centuries, the weavers whose fingers flew across looms, creating patterns that carried meanings, symbols of protection or prosperity woven into the fabric of everyday life. There were the travelers, the merchants who learned multiple languages out of necessity, who developed sophisticated mental arithmetic to convert currencies and calculate profits across different systems of weights and measures, who carried news and gossip along with their goods, connecting distant places through their journeys, the pilgrims walking to Santiago or Canterbury or Rome or Jerusalem, seeking healing or forgiveness or simply something beyond the confines of their ordinary existence. There were the children, growing up in worlds we can only partially reconstruct, learning through watching and imitating, beginning work, young, sometimes very young, but also playing games that appear in manuscript margins, tag and ball games and games with dolls and toy weapons, experiencing childhood in ways both utterly different from modern experience and yet recognizably human, the same delight in movement and imagination, the same need for affection and security. There were the elderly, those who survived past the high mortality of youth and middle age, who carried memory of earlier times, who provided continuity and counsel, whose experience of plague or famine or war informed community decisions, whose stories transmitted knowledge and values and identity across generations, human libraries in a world where most people could not read. There were moments of transcendence woven into the fabric of ordinary life, the elevation of the host during Mass, that instant when bread and wine became body and blood, when the finite touched the infinite, when peasants and lords alike knelt before mystery, the singing of Compline in a monastery as darkness fell, voices rising in unison, plain song that had been sung the same way for centuries, creating continuity through sound, connecting the present moment to all the moments that had come before and all that would come after. There were the illuminated manuscripts, monks spending months on a single page, grinding pigments from minerals and plants, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan for the deep blues, gold leaf applied with patient precision, creating images of such beauty that they seemed to glow with inner light. These were not mere decorations. They were theology rendered visible, Attempts to make the divine present through color and form, prayers offered in pigment and gold. There were the cathedral builders, understanding mathematics through practice rather than theory, using simple tools, plumb lines and measuring rods and compasses, to create structures of breathtaking complexity. The master masons, who held knowledge of proportion and stress in their minds, who could envision how a building would stand before a single stone was laid, who worked in a tradition that valued the accumulated wisdom of the craft over individual innovation, yet who also pushed boundaries, made each cathedral unique, a dialogue between tradition and creativity. There were the seasons, experienced with an intensity hard to imagine in our climate-controlled world. Winter that could mean genuine hardship, cold that penetrated to the bone, darkness that dominated the day, the precious hoarding of light and warmth, and then spring, the overwhelming relief of lengthening days, of green returning to the world, of animals bearing young, festivals that celebrated survival and renewal with genuine joy born of genuine fear overcome. There were the sounds, the bells that structured time and space, calling to prayer, marking hours, warning of danger, celebrating festivals, their tones carrying across valleys, each bell with its own voice recognized by those who lived within range, the sounds of animals ever present, cattle and sheep and pigs and chickens, horses and dogs, the human voice raised in song or prayer or argument, the clang of metal on metal, the creak of cartwheels and mill wheels, a soundscape rich and varied and utterly different from the mechanical hum that would come later. There were the smells, bread baking, beer brewing, animals in close quarters, human bodies that bathed infrequently, wood smoke that permeated everything, the sweet decay of thatch, the sharp tang of the newly cut timber, incense in churches, the complex odors of tanneries and dye works, each place with its own olfactory signature, contributing to a sense of identity and belonging. There were the tastes, simple foods, elevated by hunger and by genuine scarcity of alternatives. Bread that was the staff of life, varied in quality, from the fine white bread of the wealthy to the coarse dark bread of peasants, but always central. Pottage, the eternal stew that simmered over fires, vegetables and grains and occasional meat, flavored with herbs from the garden, beer and ale as daily beverages, safer than water and providing calories and nutrition, wine for those who could afford it or who lived where vines grew. There were the textures, wool against skin, coarse or fine, depending on status and wealth, linen for those who could afford it, the smoothness of polished wood, the cool solidity of stone, the rough weave of hemp rope, the soft resistance of clay before firing, the resistance of iron under the hammer, each material with its own qualities, its own possibilities and limitations, known intimately by those who worked with it daily. There were hierarchies, intricate and deeply felt, but also more fluid than sometimes imagined. Serfs who became free, merchants who bought land and married into nobility, younger sons of nobles who entered the church and rose through ability and connections, women who found power through religious life or widowhood. The system was constraining, often brutally so, but it was not completely static, and people navigated it with the same complexity and agency that humans bring to any social order. There were beliefs that ordered the cosmos, heaven above, hell below, earth as the theater where salvation or damnation was decided, a world alive with spiritual presences, angels and demons, saints whose intercession could be sought, relics that carried power, a sacramental universe where the material and spiritual interpenetrated, where nothing was merely physical. Everything carried potential meaning. Everything could point toward or away from the divine. And there was beauty, deliberate and accidental. The rose window at Chartres, light transformed into color and pattern, speaking of order and radiance. The songs of troubadours, love elevated to art. Desire transmuted into poetry. The decorated initials in manuscripts, playful and profound. Monks allowing humor and observation to intrude into sacred texts. Marginal figures that reveal the vitality and strangeness of medieval imagination. Rabbits hunting hunters, foxes preaching to geese, the world turned upside down in the borders of the page. The medieval world was not, as sometimes imagined, merely a bridge between classical antiquity and the modern world, a dark interval to be endured and overcome. It was its own time, with its own achievements and failures, its own ways of being human, its own answers to the fundamental questions of how to live, how to organize society, how to seek meaning, how to create beauty, how to face suffering and death, how to hope. The people of medieval Europe were not simpler than us. Their minds worked the same way ours do, capable of the same range of thought and feeling. They were constrained by different material conditions, possessed different knowledge, held different beliefs, but they were fully human, loving and hating, creating and destroying, hoping and despairing, finding joy in small things and wrestling with large questions, building lives of meaning within the circumstances they inherited and the choices they made. To look back at medieval Europe is not to find a lost golden age. There was too much suffering, too much violence, too much inequality and injustice for nostalgia. But neither is it to find only darkness and ignorance. There was too much beauty, too much intellectual achievement, too much human flourishing despite limitations. The truth lies in holding both together, acknowledging the full complexity of a civilization that lasted 1,000 years and shaped the trajectory of the world that followed. The stones remain, cathedrals and castles, abbeys and bridges, weathered by centuries but still standing, still capable of inspiring wonder. The manuscripts survive in libraries, their pages turned carefully by scholars, their illuminations still radiant. The ideas persist, transformed and adapted, but traceable. Threads running from medieval thought into our own time. Debates about authority and freedom, about faith and reason, about justice and power, questions that each generation must answer anew. And perhaps that is what remains most valuable. Not specific answers, not particular institutions or beliefs, but the reminder that humans have always grappled with how to live well, how to create meaning, how to organize communities, how to seek truth and beauty, that the medieval world was one long experiment in human possibility, neither wholly successful nor wholly failed, but simply human. A testament to what people can build and imagine and endure, to the resilience and creativity and fallibility that define our species. The light fades now across the imagined landscape of medieval Europe. The bells ring vespers, the last time before darkness falls, in villages and monasteries and cathedral towns, marking the boundary between day and night. between labor and rest. The cycle continues, as it has always continued, generations rising and falling like waves, each leaving its mark, its contributions and its ruins, its gifts and its burdens for those who come after. The fires are banked, the work of the day finished, bread set to rise for tomorrow, animals settled for the night. The rhythm of life that has sustained humanity through all its ages, in all its forms, continues, adapting, persisting, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and folly of all who came before. And in the stillness, in the gathering dark, there is a kind of peace, the peace of work completed, of community maintained, of traditions honored, of mysteries contemplated, the peace of knowing one's place in a story much larger than any individual life, a story that stretches back to the beginning and forward to an end none can see, but all are part of. The medieval world recedes, becomes memory, becomes history, becomes story. And in becoming story, it remains accessible to imagination, available for contemplation, 1,000 years condensed into images and ideas, fragments and monuments, texts and traditions, inviting us to wonder, to question, to remember that other ways of being human have existed, other answers have been tried, other beauties created, other challenges faced. The darkness is complete now. The stars emerge, the same stars that shone on medieval Europe, on all the people we have imagined, whose lives we have briefly inhabited. They looked up at these stars and wondered, as we wonder, as humans have always wondered, seeking pattern and meaning in the wheeling heavens, telling stories to make sense of existence, reaching toward transcendence even while rooted in the earth. And in that reaching, in that wondering, in that storytelling, the connection holds across centuries and continents and cultures, the thread of human consciousness, aware and questioning and creating, finding beauty in unexpected places, making meaning from chaos, building and destroying and building again. The endless work of being human continues, has always continued, will continue, long after we too have become memory, become history, become part of the story we leave for those who come after, fading now, gently, like light at dusk, like breath becoming still, like a story finding its ending, its natural rest, its quiet close. I stand in a field under a sky that seems to stretch endlessly in all directions, the grass beneath me soft and yielding, and above, nothing but the vast open blue that has called to human hearts since the very beginning of wonder. There is something about looking upward that changes the nature of dreaming, something that makes the impossible feel suddenly within reach. And I find myself thinking about all those who came before, all those who stood in fields like this one, or on cliffsides or in meadows, and felt that same magnetic pull toward the heavens. The air is cool and gentle, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere in the distance a bird crosses the sky with effortless grace, its wings catching the light, and I watch the way it moves through that invisible ocean above us, the way it belongs there, as if the sky itself were holding it aloft. For so long, for countless generations, that kind of movement belonged only to birds, to insects with their gossamer wings, to seeds carried on the wind, and humanity could only watch, could only wonder, could only imagine what it might feel like to slip free from the earth's embrace and move through that blue expanse. I think about the old stories, the myths that grew from that longing, tales of feathered cloaks and wax-sealed wings, of inventors who dreamed in wood and fabric, who sketched impossible designs by candlelight, their minds racing ahead of what their hands could build, their visions dancing just beyond the edge of what the world would allow. The breeze picks up slightly, moving through the grass in long sweeping patterns, like waves on an invisible sea, and I can almost feel the texture of those ancient dreams, the weight of all that yearning, all that careful observation of how birds bank and turn, how they ride the currents, how they make the air their home. There is a particular quality to evening light, the way it softens everything, makes the ordinary somehow luminous. And standing here now, I imagine all those forgotten moments when someone stood in similar light and thought, what if we could find a way? What if the answer were simpler than we imagined? What if we stopped trying to fly like birds and instead learned to move through air as air itself moves? The shadows are growing longer now, stretching across the field, and in this golden hour everything feels poised between what was and what might be. And I think about how every great change begins this way, in stillness, in observation, in the quiet accumulation of small understanding building upon understanding. Somewhere overhead a cloud drifts, slow and stately, and I watch its shape change almost imperceptibly, the way it holds together even as it transforms. And there is something in that, something about staying aloft, about finding the balance between weight and lift, between falling and soaring. The grass whispers around me, and I am aware suddenly of standing at a threshold, not just in this field, not just in this moment, but at the edge of a story that changed everything about how humans move through the world, a story that begins with dreamers and tinkerers, with those who refuse to accept that the sky must remain forever out of reach. I can picture them, those early pioneers, bent over drawings, testing materials, calculating angles, failing and trying again, driven by something deeper than mere ambition, something more like love. Love for the challenge, love for the beauty of flight itself, love for the sheer audacious possibility that maybe, just maybe, the thing everyone said could not be done might actually be possible. The light continues to shift, moment by moment, and the sky takes on new colors, pale golds bleeding into softer blues. And I realize that this is where it all begins, in moments like this, in the space between earth and heaven, in the quiet determination of those who looked up and refused to look away. And so the story unfolds, not all at once, but gradually, like the evening itself, like the slow, patient work of understanding how air moves, how surfaces can shape that movement, how human ingenuity might find a way to dance with physics rather than fight against it. I take a breath, and the air fills my lungs. This same substance that seemed so insubstantial, so invisible, and yet contains within it the possibility of holding us aloft, of carrying us across continents, of connecting the world in ways that would have seemed pure magic to those who first dreamed of flight. The field grows quieter still, and I stand here at the beginning, ready to trace the long arc of how we learned to fly. The story begins long before anyone succeeded, begins in the careful watching, in the centuries of human eyes turned skyward with questions that had no answers yet, And if we trace it back far enough, we find ourselves in Renaissance workshops, in the mind of a man named Leonardo, who filled page after page with sketches of wings and mechanisms, drawings that would sleep in notebooks for hundreds of years before anyone understood what he had seen. Leonardo da Vinci stood at his window in Milan, watching birds, studying the way a kestrel would hover motionless against the wind, and his hand moved across parchment, capturing angles, proportions, the complex articulation of wing joints, and he dreamed of ornithopters, of machines with flapping wings that might carry a human body aloft, though the materials of his time, the understanding of his era, could not yet bridge the gap between vision and reality. The centuries rolled forward, and others tried, inventors in France, in England, brave souls who strapped wings to their arms and leapt from towers and fell, always fell, because they were chasing the wrong dream, trying to become birds rather than understanding what birds understood. That flight is not about flapping, not really, but about shape, about the way air flows over a curved surface. By the time the 1700s arrived, by the time the Montgolfier brothers stood in their paper mill in Annonay, something had shifted. Joseph and Jacques watched smoke rising from a fire, watched how it carried embers upward, and they began to wonder, not about wings, but about containment, about trapping that rising force inside something light enough to be carried. On a June day in 1783, in the town square, they launched a sphere of linen and paper 33 feet across, and it rose, lifted by hot air, climbed to perhaps 6,000 feet, and the crowd below watched in amazement as this impossible object defied everything. They thought they knew about what must fall and what could float. That same year, just months later, a hydrogen balloon rose over Paris, designed by Jacques Charles, and this one carried a man, Pilatre de Rosier, who became the first human to experience sustained flight, rising above the city, looking down at streets transformed into ribbons, at buildings become toys, at a world remade by altitude. And for 25 minutes he hung there between earth and sky, and everything changed. But balloons, for all their wonder, were prisoners of the wind. They could go up, they could descend, but they went where the air took them, and the dreamers wanted more, wanted control, wanted to choose their direction, their destination. The 1800s brought new urgency, new materials, new understanding of air as something that could be measured, calculated, predicted. And in England, a man named George Cayley began to think differently about the whole problem, began to see that flight required three separate things working together: lift, thrust, and control. Cayley built gliders, tested them on the hills near his estate, and in 1804 he achieved something remarkable. A model glider that could sustain itself, could maintain altitude, could demonstrate that fixed wings, wings that did not flap, could hold something aloft if they were shaped correctly, if they met the air at the right angle. He understood what others had missed, that a curved wing, an airfoil, creates different pressures above and below, that air moving faster over the top creates a kind of suction, a lifting force, and this understanding, this insight, was the key that would eventually unlock powered flight, though Cayley himself would not live to see it realized. Across decades, across continents, others picked up the thread. Otto Lilienthal in Germany became obsessed with gliding, with the pure experience of hanging in air, and he built glider after glider, more than 18 different designs, and he flew them, launching himself from hills, feeling the wind hold him, learning in his body what could only partially be understood in diagrams. Lilienthal made more than 2,000 flights, and he documented everything, published tables of lift coefficients, described the sensation of controlling a glider with shifts of body weight, and people began to read his work, began to understand that flight was not some distant dream, but a solvable problem, a series of challenges that patience and experimentation might overcome. In 1896, on a Sunday afternoon in August, Lilienthal launched from his usual hill, and something went wrong. A gust caught him, the glider stalled, and he fell. And the next day he died from his injuries, but his last words carried forward. Sacrifices must be made, and they echoed in the minds of everyone who came after. Two of those who studied Lilienthal's work were brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, who ran a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and they read everything they could find about flying machine, devoured Lilienthal's tables, studied Cayley's principles, and they began to see gaps, places where the existing knowledge was incomplete or wrong. The Wright brothers were methodical, patient, and they understood something crucial, that the problem of flight was really three problems, and you had to solve all three. You needed wings that could generate lift. You needed a way to move forward through the air. And you needed a method of control, of steering, of maintaining balance in 3 dimensions. They started with gliders, built their first one in 1900, and they needed a place to test it, somewhere with steady winds, with soft landings, and they wrote to the Weather Bureau, studied climate data, and chose a thin strip of sand on the North Carolina coast, a place called Kitty Hawk, where the wind came frosty, reliable and strong off the ocean. That first glider mostly flew as a kite, tethered, tested, and it taught them that the published tables they had relied on, the data from Lilienthal and others, were wrong. The lift coefficients were incorrect, and this meant they would have to start over, would have to generate their own data, their own understanding. Back in Dayton, in the room behind their bicycle shop, they built a wind tunnel, a wooden box 6 feet long with a fan at one end, and they crafted tiny model wings, more than 200 different shapes, and tested each one, measured the forces, recorded the results, and slowly, painstakingly, they built up a new foundation of knowledge that was accurate, that was theirs. Their second glider in 1901 was larger, and it revealed new problems, issues with control, with stability, and they realized that the tail needed to be movable, that control required the ability to adjust not just the wings, but the rear surfaces, to coordinate movements, to think of the aircraft as a unified system. By 1902, they had refined their design, had added a movable rudder, had developed a system they called wing warping, where wires could twist the wingtips, change their angle to the air, and this gave them the control they needed, the ability to bank, to turn, to recover from disturbances. But gliding was not enough. Gliding was falling slowly, with style perhaps, but still dependent on hills, on gravity, and they wanted true flight, wanted to go where they chose, and that meant power, meant an engine light enough and strong enough to pull them through the air. They asked engine manufacturers, sent specifications, and everyone said it could not be done. Could not build an engine with the power-to-weight ratio they needed, so they built it themselves. They and their mechanic, Charlie Taylor, crafted an engine from scratch, 4 cylinders, 12 horsepower, weighing just over 150 pounds, and it was crude, basic, but it was enough. And they designed propellers, not just any propellers, but propellers understood as rotating wings, as airfoils that pushed against the air. And they calculated the pitch, the shape, working from first principles, because no one had done this before. No one had tried to optimize thrust for an aircraft that would fly horizontally through the air. By December of 1903, everything was ready. The glider design proven, the engine tested, the propellers carved and balanced, and they returned to Kitty Hawk, to that windswept beach, set up their camp, assembled their machine, and waited for conditions to be right. On the 14th, they tried, won the coin toss that would determine who flew first, but the machine lifted too quickly, stalled, fell back, damaged the frame, and they spent days repairing it, adjusting, preparing to try again. December 17th dawned cold, wind at 27 miles per hour, and they set up on level ground this time, laid a wooden rail, a track for the machine to roll along until it achieved flight speed, and Orville climbed into position, lying prone on the lower wing, hand on the control lever. The engine coughed to life. The propellers spun, and at 10:35 in the morning, with Wilbur running alongside, steadying the wing, the machine lifted, rose from the rail, flew under its own power for 12 seconds, covered 120 feet, and when it settled back to Earth, everything had changed. They flew 3 more times that day, each flight longer than the last, and on the 4th attempt, Wilbur stayed aloft for 59 seconds, traveled 852 feet, and it was unmistakable now, undeniable. This was controlled, sustained, powered flight. The age of aviation had begun, though the world did not know it yet, did not quite believe. Would take years to fully understand what had happened on that beach in that cold December wind, when 2 bicycle mechanics achieved what emperors and philosophers had only dreamed of. The newspapers were skeptical, dismissed the reports as exaggeration, as the fevered claims of provincial tinkerers. And even when the brothers offered to demonstrate their machine to the United States government, to the military, the letters were ignored, filed away, considered too fantastical to warrant serious attention. But the Wright brothers were not deterred. They returned to Dayton to a field called Huffman Prairie, 8 miles outside the city, and there they continued to fly, to refine, to push the boundaries of what their machine could do. And by 1905, they were staying aloft for more than half an hour, flying circles, figure eights, demonstrating a level of control that made it clear this was no accident, no lucky fluke. Word began to spread, not through official channels, but through whispers, through the accounts of farmers who had seen the strange machine circling overhead. And slowly, reluctantly, the world began to pay attention, began to understand that the age of the airship and the balloon was giving way to something entirely new. In France, in those early years of the 1900s, aviation enthusiasts were pursuing their own dreams. Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian living in Paris, was building aircraft of his own design, And in October of 1906, he flew his 14Bs in front of a crowd, covered 220 feet, and Paris erupted in celebration, convinced that Santos Dumont had achieved the first true flight, because they had not believed the American claims, had not seen the Wright brothers fly. The rivalry spurred innovations, pushed designers to test new configurations, new approaches, and across Europe, workshops filled with the sound of engines being tuned, of fabric being stretched over frames, of propellers being carved and balanced, and each month brought news of longer flights, higher altitudes, new records set and broken. By 1908, the Wright brothers finally demonstrated their machine publicly. Wilbur flew in France, at Le Mans, and the European aviators who had doubted, who had dismissed the American claims, watched in stunned silence as he circled the field with a grace and control their machines could not match, banking smoothly, turning with precision, and they understood immediately that the Wrights were years ahead, that they had solved problems the Europeans were still struggling with. The demonstrations changed everything, sparked what historians would later call aviation fever, a sudden explosion of interest and investment, and within months there were aviation meets, competitions with prize money, crowds gathering to watch these fragile machines lift into the air, and every successful flight pushed the dream further, made the impossible more ordinary. In 1909, Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel, flew from France to England in 37 minutes, and this simple journey, this brief pop over water, shattered the psychological barrier that had made Britain feel separate, protected by the sea, and military strategists across Europe suddenly understood that aircraft were not toys, not curiosities, but weapons, tools that could change the nature of war itself. The aircraft of those early years were terrifyingly fragile. Frames of wood and wire, wings covered in fabric doped with lacquer, engines that sputtered and failed, and pilots flew without parachutes, without instruments, navigating by landmarks, by the feel of wind on their faces, and the mortality rate was staggering. Almost every pioneer of those years knew someone who had died in a crash, who had misjudged an approach or suffered an engine failure or been caught by unexpected wind. But still they flew, driven by something beyond reason, by the sheer intoxicating freedom of it, the way the world transformed from above, the way roads became lines and cities became patterns, the way altitude changed perspective, made human concerns seem small and temporary. Glenn Curtiss in America developed his own designs, created the first practical seaplane, an aircraft that could land on water, take off from harbors, and this opened new possibilities, new routes, new ways of thinking about where aircraft could go and what they could do. By 1910, there were air shows drawing crowds of thousands, pilots performing stunts, loops and rolls, flying upside down, pushing the machines to their limits, and some of these pilots became celebrities, their names in newspapers, their photographs sold as postcards. Harriet Quimby, the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, Bessica Raish, who built and flew her own aircraft, these pioneers proving that the sky belonged to anyone with courage and skill. The Great War came in 1914, and aviation was still in its infancy. The first military aircraft were used for reconnaissance, for observation, pilots flying over enemy lines, sketching troop positions, reporting back. And at first, when two aircraft met in the air, the pilots would wave, sometimes even greet each other, because they were part of a small fraternity, a community of those who understood what it meant to fly. But war has its own logic, its own momentum, and soon the observers began carrying pistols, rifles, trying to shoot at enemy aircraft, and then machine guns were mounted, first firing through gaps in the propeller arc, and then, in 1915, a Dutchman named Anthony Fokker developed an interrupter gear, a mechanism that synchronized the gun with the propeller, allowed bullets to fire between the spinning blades, and suddenly aircraft became hunters, became weapons in the sky. The fighter plane was born from this single-seat aircraft built for speed and maneuverability, and pilots who excelled at aerial combat became known as aces, men like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who painted his aircraft bright crimson, who shot down 80 Allied planes, became a legend even to his enemies. And on the other side, Eddie Rickenbacker, René Fonck, pilots who developed tactics, learned to dive out of the sun, to coordinate attacks, to think in 3 dimensions. Aircraft evolved rapidly under the pressure of war. Engines became more powerful, more reliable. Designs shifted from wood and fabric to include metal components, and by 1918 there were aircraft that could reach speeds of 130 miles per hour, could climb to 20,000 feet, could carry bombs and cameras and wireless radios. The war ended, and the world was left with thousands of trained pilots, hundreds of surplus aircraft, and a new question: what to do with aviation in peacetime, how to take this technology born from conflict and reshape it for connection, for commerce, for bringing the world closer together. Airmail service began almost immediately. Pilots flying routes between cities, carrying letters and packages, and these flights were dangerous, flown without instruments through weather, through fog and rain and snow, and many pilots died, crashed into mountains obscured by cloud, ran out of fuel searching for landing fields, but the service continued because it proved something important, proved that aircraft could be useful, could serve a purpose beyond spectacle or war. In 1919, 2 British pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Brown, flew a modified bomber across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland, 16 hours through storm and ice, their windscreen cracking, their instruments failing, navigating by stars glimpsed through breaks in cloud, and when they landed in an Irish bog, when they climbed from their aircraft exhausted and half-frozen, they had proven that the ocean was no longer an insurmountable barrier. The 1920s brought a new era, an age of aviation pioneers pushing boundaries, testing limits. Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic solo in 1927, 33 hours alone in the spirit of St. Louis. No radio, no parachute, just dead reckoning and determination. And when he landed at Le Bourget Field in Paris, 100,000 people rushed the runway, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what he had accomplished. Amelia Earhart followed, first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger in 1928, then solo in 1932, and she became more than a pilot, became a symbol, proof that aviation belonged to everyone, that the sky recognized no gender, and she pushed further, flew from Hawaii to California, from Mexico to New York, set records, and then broke them until that final flight in 1937 when she disappeared over the Pacific, searching for a tiny island in an endless ocean. Commercial aviation began to emerge, airlines forming to carry passengers, Pan American Airways, Imperial Airways, KLM. And the aircraft evolved to meet this new purpose, became larger, more comfortable. The Ford Trimotor, the Douglas DC-3, planes that could carry 20 or 30 passengers in relative comfort, that had enclosed cabins, that made flying accessible to those who were not adventurers or daredevils. By the 1930s, air travel was becoming routine, not common yet, not affordable for most, but established, expected, and routes were spreading across continents, across oceans, flying boats, massive seaplanes like the Pan Am Clippers, landing in harbors, refueling at island bases, connecting America to Europe, to Asia, to places that had seemed impossibly distant just decades before, and all the while the technology advanced. Engines became radial, then inline. Superchargers allowed flight at higher altitudes. Retractable landing gear reduced drag. All metal construction replaced wood and fabric, and each innovation built on the last created new possibilities, new challenges to overcome. The military watched these developments, understood that the next war, if it came, would be fought in 3 dimensions, and they invested in bombers, in fighters, in aircraft that could carry tons of explosives, that could fly faster than sound seemed to allow, and designers like R.J. Mitchell in Britain created the Spitfire, a fighter so beautiful it seemed to embody flight itself, all curves and purpose. And in America, in Germany, in Russia, engineers were solving the same problems, creating machines that would soon fill the skies in terrible numbers. The Second World War arrived in 1939, and aviation became central to everything, to strategy, to survival, to the outcome of battles fought across continents and oceans, and the pace of innovation accelerated beyond anything seen before, driven by necessity, by the knowledge that superiority in the air could determine who lived and who perished. Britain stood alone in 1940, facing the Luftwaffe, facing waves of German bombers escorted by fighters, and the Battle of Britain was fought entirely in the sky, Spitfires and Hurricanes rising to meet the threat. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, climbing into cockpits knowing the odds, knowing that each sortie might be their last, and they flew anyway, day after day, until the German offensive faltered, until the threat of invasion receded. The war pushed aircraft to new extremes. Bombers grew massive, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Lancaster, aircraft that could carry thousands of pounds of explosives across enemy territory, that flew in formations of hundreds, darkening the sky. And the crews who flew these missions, 10 men packed into each bomber, faced flak and fighters, faced temperatures far below zero at altitude, and many did not return, fell from the sky over Germany, over the Pacific. Their sacrifice measured in the slow liberation of occupied lands. In the Pacific theater, aircraft carriers became floating air bases, and the war was fought across vast distances of ocean. American Corsairs and Hellcats facing Japanese Zeros, and the nature of aerial combat evolved, became about energy management, about teamwork, about using altitude and speed to overcome an enemy's maneuverability. And pilots learned these lessons in combat. Those who survived, those who returned to teach the next wave, and then, in the final years of the war, came the jets, the Me-262, Germany's desperate attempt to regain air superiority, an aircraft without propellers, powered by turbines, capable of speeds that left conventional fighters behind. And though it came too late to change the outcome, it announced the future, showed that propeller-driven aircraft had reached their limits, that the next era would belong to jet propulsion. The war ended in 1945, and once again the world was transformed. Aviation had proven itself essential, had shown that distance was no longer protection, that oceans could be crossed in hours, that the globe was smaller than anyone had imagined, and the technology developed for war, the long-range bombers, the powerful engines, the navigation systems, all of this could be repurposed, could serve peace. Commercial aviation exploded in the post-war years. Airlines bought surplus military transports, converted bombers into passenger planes, and new designs emerged: the Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, aircraft with pressurized cabins that could fly above the weather, that made air travel comfortable, almost routine, and the number of passengers grew exponentially, hundreds of thousands, then millions, air travel becoming not a luxury, but an expectation, a normal part of modern life. The jet age arrived commercially in 1952, the de Havilland Comet, sleek and fast, cutting flight times in half, and passengers marveled at the smooth, quiet ride, at the way jets climbed quickly above turbulence, at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, though the early comets suffered catastrophic failures, metal fatigue causing the fuselage to rupture at altitude, and the fleet was grounded, redesigned, the lessons learned written in tragedy. America's answer came with the Boeing 707, introduced in 1958, an aircraft that defined the jet age, that made transatlantic flight accessible, that carried over 100 passengers in comfort at speeds that seemed impossible just years before, and Pan Am ordered them by the dozen, launched routes connecting every continent, and suddenly London was hours from New York. Tokyo was reachable in a day. The world was shrinking. The Cold War drove military aviation to new heights, literally and figuratively. Spy planes like the U-2 flying at 70,000 feet, above the reach of interceptors, photographing Soviet installations with cameras so powerful they could read license plates from the edge of space. And when one was finally shot down in 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was captured, it created an international incident proved that even the stratosphere was no sanctuary. And then came the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft so advanced it seemed alien, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3, over 2,000 miles per hour, flying so high and fast that missiles could not catch it, its titanium skin heating to 600 degrees from friction with the thin air, and it flew reconnaissance missions for decades, retired finally in 1998, still the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built. Commercial aviation continued its evolution. Aircraft grew larger. The Boeing 747 arrived in 1970, a wide-body jet with two aisles capable of carrying over 400 passengers, and it transformed international travel, made it economical, made it possible for ordinary people to cross oceans, to visit distant relatives, to experience cultures that had existed only in books and photographs. The Concorde flew in 1976, a supersonic passenger jet cruising at Mach 2, cutting the Atlantic crossing to under 4 hours. And there was something beautiful about it, the delta wing, the drooping nose, the sheer audacity of making supersonic travel routine, though it was expensive, exclusive, a technological marvel that served the few rather than the many, and it flew for 27 years before retiring, a footnote to an era, a reminder that faster is not always better. The late 20th century brought refinement rather than revolution. Aircraft became more efficient, more reliable. Composite materials replaced aluminum. Fly-by-wire systems replaced mechanical controls. Computers managed everything from navigation to fuel consumption. And flying became the safest form of transportation. Safer than driving, safer than crossing the street, the accident rate dropping year by year as technology and training improved. Airbus challenged Boeing's dominance, introduced the A320, the A380, the latter a double-decker giant capable of carrying over 500 passengers. An aircraft so large that airports had to modify their gates to accommodate it, and the competition drove both companies to innovate, to create aircraft that burned less fuel, that flew farther, that carried more with less environmental impact. Military aviation entered the stealth era, aircraft designed to be invisible to radar. The F-117, the B-2 Spirit, shapes that seemed to defy aerodynamics, all angles and flat surfaces. And they represented a new kind of warfare, one where detection mattered more than speed, where the ability to strike unseen was worth more than the ability to outrun a pursuer. Drones emerged, unmanned aerial vehicles, first as reconnaissance platforms, then as weapons, Predators and Reapers, flying missions controlled by pilots thousands of miles away, sitting in air-conditioned trailers in Nevada, flying aircraft over Afghanistan. And this created new ethical questions, new considerations about warfare, about presence and absence, about what it means to fight when the fighter is not at risk. Commercial aviation became a global network. Airlines forming alliances, code sharing, making it possible to book a single ticket that would take you from a small town in America to a village in Thailand, with multiple connections, seamless transfers, luggage tracked electronically, and millions of people flying every day. The sky crisscrossed with contrails, each one marking a journey, a purpose, a connection being made. The 21st century brought new challenges: the environmental impact of aviation, the carbon emissions, the contribution to climate change, and engineers began working on solutions: more efficient engines, alternative fuels, electric aircraft for short routes. And the questions became not just how to fly, but how to fly sustainably, how to maintain this incredible connectivity without destroying the planet that made it possible. Aircraft continued to evolve. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, built largely from composites, more fuel efficient, with larger windows, better cabin pressure, designed around passenger comfort, and the Airbus A350, a wide-body twin-engine aircraft that could fly ultra-long routes. Singapore to New York, 19 hours non-stop, redefining what distances could be covered without landing. And through all of this, through more than a century of development, the fundamental wonder remained. The miracle of something heavier than air staying aloft, of human beings crossing continents in hours, of technology that seemed impossible becoming so routine that people complained about legroom, about delays, taking for granted the sheer audacity of flight itself, The evolution from those 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk to modern aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers, thousands of miles. This transformation happened within a single human lifetime. People born before the Wright brothers flew lived to see men walk on the moon, lived to see the sky filled with aircraft, lived to see the world connected in ways that would have seemed pure fantasy in their youth. And standing here now, in this moment of reflection, we can trace the thread, can see how each innovation built on the last, how failure taught as much as success, how the dream of flight, that ancient human longing to slip free from Earth's embrace, was finally realized not through magic or divine intervention, but through patience, through observation, through the careful application of scientific principles and human ingenuity. The story of aviation is the story of possibility, of refusing to accept limits, of looking at the impossible and asking why not. And in that story we find something profound about what it means to be human, something about our nature, our drive to explore, to connect, to transcend the boundaries that confine us. The deeper we look into flight, the more we see it as metaphor, as philosophy made tangible, because to fly is to change perspective, to see the world not as we walk through it, street by street, building by building, but as a vast interconnected whole, patterns emerging that are invisible from the ground. There is something humbling about altitude, about rising above the landscape and watching cities become clusters of light, watching mountain ranges that seemed insurmountable become wrinkles in the Earth's surface. And this shift in perspective, this ability to see the familiar made strange, has changed not just how we travel, but how we think, how we understand our place in the world. The physics of flight, when you truly consider them, remain almost magical. The idea that a curve in metal, that the simple act of moving fast enough through air creates a pressure differential sufficient to lift tons of weight and hold them aloft for hours, is still, even after more than a century, still worthy of wonder. Engineers speak of Bernoulli's principle, of Newton's third law, of the mathematics that govern lift and drag and thrust, and all of this is true, is measurable, is predictable, but there is something in the experience of flight that transcends equations, something that speaks to older dreams, older longings. Every aircraft is a compromise, a negotiation between competing forces, between the desire for speed and the need for efficiency, between strength and weight, between what we want the machine to do and what physics will allow. And in these compromises, we see the art within the engineering, the creativity required to solve problems that have no perfect answer. The cockpit of a modern airliner contains hundreds of instruments, screens displaying speed and altitude and heading, systems monitoring fuel flow and engine temperature and 1,000 other variables, and yet the fundamental act remains the same as it was for the Wright brothers. You lift the nose, you feel the aircraft respond. You feel the moment when the wheels leave the ground and you transition from rolling to flying, from earthbound to airborne. Pilots speak of feeling the aircraft, of knowing through subtle vibrations and sounds when something is right or wrong. And this intuition, this connection between human and machine, persists even in an age of automation. Even when computers can land the plane more smoothly than any human hand, there remains something essential about the pilot's awareness, the human judgment that cannot quite be replicated. The history of aviation is written in both triumph and tragedy, in the names of those who succeeded and those who died trying. And we remember both. We remember Lindbergh's solo crossing, and we remember Amelia Earhart's disappearance. We remember the first moon landing made possible by aircraft technology, and we remember Challenger Columbia. The way progress sometimes demands sacrifice, we wish we did not have to make. There is a democracy in modern flight that would astound the pioneers. The idea that millions of people fly every day, that a ticket costing a few $100s can transport someone across an ocean, that flight is accessible not just to the wealthy or the adventurous, but to families on vacation, to students studying abroad, to anyone with a reason to go somewhere distant. And yet this democratization comes with loss. The loss of wonder, perhaps, the way familiarity breeds, if not contempt, then indifference. Passengers scrolling through phones while crossing the continent, complaining about Wi-Fi while traveling at 600 miles per hour, 7 miles above the earth. And maybe this is inevitable. Maybe this is what success looks like. The extraordinary becoming ordinary. But sometimes, on a clear night, when you look out the window of an aircraft and see the stars above and the lights of cities below, when you feel that subtle reminder that you are suspended between earth and space, held aloft by principles that still seem like sorcery, even when you understand the science, sometimes the wonder returns, floods back in a rush, and you remember what a miracle this is. The future of flight remains unwritten. Electric aircraft are being tested, hydrogen fuel cells explored, designs that would have seemed fantastical just years ago are being prototyped and refined, and perhaps the next century will bring changes as profound as the last. Perhaps we will look back at jet fuel and turbines the way we now look back at wood and fabric biplanes, as primitive, as the awkward first steps towards something greater. Already there are aircraft that can fly themselves, that need no pilot, and this raises questions about what flight means, about whether the human element is essential or incidental, and perhaps both answers are true. Perhaps we are building toward a future where the sky is filled with autonomous cargo carriers, with electric air taxis, with vehicles we cannot yet imagine, while also preserving a space for those who want to feel the controls, who want to experience flight not as passengers but as participants. The Wright brothers would recognize the fundamental principles in a modern aircraft, would understand lift and drag and thrust, but they would be astounded by the scale, by the millions of flights per year, by the global network that treats the atmosphere as a highway, and perhaps they would smile to know that their 12 seconds over a North Carolina beach led to this, to a world transformed, to a species that claims the sky as its domain. The light is fading now, the way it does at the end of things. And I find myself back in that field where we began, under that vast open sky, and everything has changed. Or perhaps nothing has. Perhaps the sky is still the same sky, still calling with that same ancient invitation. The story of flight is complete now, not finished, because aviation continues to evolve, continues to surprise us, but complete in the sense that we have traced the arc from dream to reality, from Leonardo's sketches to aircraft that circle the globe without landing, from human beings who could only watch birds with longing to a world where hundreds of thousands of people are aloft at any given moment. And what does it mean, this transformation, this conquest of the air? It means that distance is no longer destiny, that being born on an island or in a landlocked country does not determine the scope of your world. It means that families separated by oceans can reunite in ours, that cultures can mix and influence each other in ways that were impossible when travel meant weeks or months at sea. But it means more than convenience, more than commerce. It means that we looked at an impossible thing and made it possible, that we refused to accept the limitations that seemed absolute. And in doing so, we discovered something about ourselves, about our capacity for innovation, for persistence, for turning dreams into blueprints and blueprints into reality. The evening air is cool against my skin, and somewhere overhead, invisible in the gathering dusk, aircraft are crossing, following routes established by computers, guided by satellites, carrying people to destinations that matter to them, to weddings and funerals, to business meetings and vacations, to reunions and departures, each flight a story, each passenger a purpose. I think about that December day in 1903, about Orville lying prone on the lower wing, about Wilbur running alongside, and about that moment when the machine lifted, when it became something more than wood and fabric, when it became proof that the impossible was just the difficult waiting to be solved. And I think about all the flights since then, all the pilots who climbed into cockpits knowing the risks, all the engineers who refined and improved, all the passengers who trusted their lives to aluminum and jet fuel and the principles of aerodynamics. And the story seems less about machines and more about courage, about faith in human ingenuity, about the willingness to try even when failure seems certain. The stars are beginning to emerge. Those same stars that guided early aviators, that Lindbergh used to navigate across the Atlantic, and they seem closer somehow, more reachable. And perhaps that is what flight has given us, not just the ability to move through air, but the sense that nothing is truly beyond reach, that the universe is not a place we observe, but a place we can explore. The field is quiet now, peaceful, and the story settles into memory, into history, into the long record of human achievement, and it joins all the other stories of how we learned to do what seemed impossible, how we harnessed fire, how we crossed oceans, how we sent signals through the air, how we decoded the human genome, each achievement building on the last, each generation standing on the shoulders of those who came before. And flight, this beautiful, dangerous, impossible thing we made possible, takes its place in that progression, a reminder that we are creatures of earth who learned to move through air, who looked at birds with envy and emerged with understanding, who turned longing into science and science into reality. The darkness is almost complete now, the sky a deep blue fading to black, and the story comes to rest, comes to its natural close, the way all stories must eventually, not with fanfare or proclamation, but with a gentle settling, like an aircraft touching down after a long journey, wheels kissing the runway, the flight complete. And in this quiet ending, in this peaceful return to earth, there is satisfaction, there is wonder, there is gratitude for the dreamers and the builders, for those who believed when belief seemed foolish, who persisted when persistence seemed futile, who gave us wings. The field breathes around me, soft and dark, and somewhere distant, barely audible. The sound of an engine crosses the night sky, and I listen until it fades, until silence returns, until there is only the wind moving through grass, and the endless patient stars. There is a kind of quiet that comes only with evening, when the world slows and the noise of the day fades. And in that gentle hush, thoughts turn to things older than ourselves, to voices that have traveled across centuries, carried on the wings of carefully chosen words. Tonight the mind wanders toward poetry, toward those rare souls who shaped language into something luminous, who found music in syllables and truth in metaphor, and who left behind words that still echo in the corridors of human memory. Imagine a vast garden stretching across time itself, where each path leads to a different voice, a different vision, and each flowering plant represents a poet whose work has endured, has been whispered and sung and remembered, passed from one generation to the next like precious heirlooms. The air here feels thick with possibility, with the weight of expression, and there is something almost sacred about the space, as if the very atmosphere remembers every line ever written, every verse ever spoken aloud in the darkness, every moment when language transcended its ordinary function and became something more. In this imagined garden, the light is always soft, golden and forgiving, the kind of light that painters dream of capturing, and the shadows are long and gentle, creating spaces where contemplation feels natural, where the mind can wander without urgency or destination. The poets themselves seem to walk here too, not as they were in life, weary and complicated and bound by circumstance, but as they exist in their work, distilled into essence, into the purest expression of what they saw and felt and understood about being human. There is Homer, standing at the very edge of the garden, where it meets the wild unknown. His blind eyes turn toward something beyond sight, and his voice rises like the sea, rhythmic and powerful, speaking of the heroes and journeys and the long road home, speaking in verses that were memorized and repeated for generations before anyone thought to write them down. And there, in a corner where marble columns catch the light, is Sappho, fragments of her work scattered like petals, beautiful even in their incompleteness, speaking of desire and longing with an intensity that makes the air shimmer. Her words so vivid that 25 centuries cannot dim them. The garden paths wind and intersect, leading through different landscapes, different climates of thought and feeling, and each turn reveals another presence, another voice that shaped the way humanity speaks to itself. Here is a grove of Persian roses, and among them walks Rumi, his robes moving like water, speaking of love that dissolves boundaries, of whirling dances and divine intoxication, his words creating bridges between the earthly and the eternal, between the human heart and something vast and unknowable. The Japanese maple trees glow red and gold, and beneath their branches sits Basho, watching a frog leap into an old pond, capturing that single moment in 17 syllables, teaching the world that poetry can live in the smallest observation, that infinity can be glimpsed in a dewdrop. There are voices in English, too, weaving through the garden like familiar melodies. Shakespeare, whose sonnets explore love and time and mortality with such precision that they feel like mathematical proofs written in music, each word chosen with surgical care, each image layered with meaning. And Milton, his voice rolling like thunder across paradise lost and found, grappling with cosmic questions in verse so dense and rich it demands to be read slowly, savored like something aged and complex. The romantics gather near a wild stream, where nature grows untamed and passionate. Wordsworth, wandering lonely as a cloud, Keats standing before his Grecian urn, speaking to nightingales in autumn, finding in the natural world a mirror for human emotion, teaching that poetry could capture ecstasy, could preserve beauty in amber-like perfection. And there, in a darker corner where the shadows deepen, is Emily Dickinson, keeper of small truths, observer of death and immortality from her window in Amherst, writing poems that seem simple until you look closer, until you realize how much weight she carried in her dashes and her slant rhymes. The garden continued, Crusten, spreading in all directions, encompassing continents and centuries, and the remarkable thing is how these voices speak to each other, how they answer and challenge and build upon what came before, creating a conversation that spans all of human history. This is where the journey begins, in this imagined space where poetry lives, where the greatest practitioners of the art still walk and speak, where their words hang in the air like visible breath on a cold morning, beautiful and temporary and essential. And to understand this garden, to know these voices, is to understand something fundamental about what it means to be human, to feel and think and struggle, to express the inexpressible through the ancient and ever-new medium of verse. The garden begins where language itself begins, in the firelight of ancient gatherings, where story and song were not yet separated, where the first poets were also priests and historians and keepers of collective memory. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, recording the epic of Gilgamesh, a story so old it predates the alphabet, telling of a king who sought immortality and found instead the bitter sweetness of human limitation. And though we don't know the name of the poet who first shaped these tales, their voice survives, speaking across an almost incomprehensible distance. The verse moved in patterns, repeating phrases like waves returning to shore, making the epic easier to remember in a world where memory was the only library. And already, even at this earliest moment, poetry was doing what it would always do, taking the chaos of human experience and giving it shape, giving it rhythm, making it something that could be carried forward. In the Mediterranean world, poetry emerged from the sea itself, from the salt, bright Aegean where Homer stood, blind or perhaps never singular, perhaps a tradition rather than a man, singing the Iliad and the Odyssey in dactylic hexameter, that rolling 6-beat line that mimics the sound of oars in water, the march of soldiers, the inevitable progression of fate. These epics were not written at first. They were performed, and the poet was a kind of musician, using formulaic phrases like building blocks, rosy-fingered dawn, and wine-dark sea, and swift-footed Achilles, epithets that served as both description and mnemonic device, helping the singer remember the thousands of lines that made up the tale, and what tales they were, full of rage and pride and the terrible beauty of warfare, full of cunning, Odysseus finding his way home through monsters and enchantments, teaching the Greeks what it meant to be Greek, what values to cherish, what warnings to heed. By the 7th century before the Common Era, poetry had found a new voice in Sappho, writing on the island of Lesbos, and here something shifted. The epic scope narrowed to the intensity of personal feeling, to desire and jealousy and the ache of beauty. She wrote in the lyric meters meant to be sung to the lyre, and though only fragments of her 9 books survive, those fragments burn with an immediacy that feels utterly modern. She wrote of a girl whose laughter made her heart race, of apple blossoms and the moon and stars, of wedding songs and hymns to Aphrodite. And in doing so, she established that poetry could be intimate, could speak from the personal rather than the cosmic, could make private emotion into something universal. The Greeks understood poetry as techne, as craft, something that could be studied and refined. And by the 5th century, in Athens, dramatic poetry had evolved. Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides writing verse for actors to speak on stage, exploring fate and free will through the mouths of mythological characters, making poetry a public art, a civic responsibility. Meanwhile, in the East, other traditions were flowering. In China during the Zhou dynasty, the Shijing, or classic of poetry, collected 305 songs, folk ballads, and aristocratic odes and ritual hymns, preserving voices from the 11th to the 7th centuries before the Common Era, voices singing of love and war and the turning seasons, of soldiers longing for home and women waiting by rivers. Confucius himself would later emphasize the study of these poems, believing they could cultivate moral character and social harmony, that the right words in the right order could shape a person's inner life, could teach empathy and righteousness. And so poetry became embedded in Chinese education, in the examination system that would persist for millennia. In India, the great Sanskrit epics were taking shape. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, vast poem cycles that contained within them entire worlds, philosophies and genealogies and moral dilemmas. Valmiki composing the Ramayana in elegant shlokas, couplets that balanced perfectly, creating a rhythm that could carry a listener through tens of thousands of verses. And beyond the epics, the Vedic hymns, even older, poems of praise to gods of fire and sky and soma, composed by rishis who claimed to see the cosmic order, who used language as a form of magic, believing that the right words spoken with the right intention could shape reality itself. The Romans inherited Greek forms and transformed them. Virgil writing the Aeneid in conscious homage to Homer, but with a Roman purpose, celebrating Augustus and the founding of empire, taking 12 years to write 12 books, polishing each line until it gleamed, creating what would become the model for epic poetry in Europe for the next 1,500 years. And there was Ovid, playful and erotic and brilliant, writing the Metamorphose, a collection of transformation myths that flowed like quicksilver from one story to the next, everything changing, everything in flux, gods becoming animals, becoming stars, becoming trees, teaching that the only constant in existence is change itself. Horace wrote odes that explored friendship and mortality and the pleasures of a modest life, his voice intimate and philosophical, setting a template for lyric poetry that would echo through the centuries, the personal meditation, the turning over of experience to find meaning in it. As Rome fell, poetry became the property of monasteries, of monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, preserving Virgil and Ovid while the empire crumbled outside their walls. And for centuries in Europe, poetry meant Latin poetry, meant classical forms and Christian themes, meant hymns and liturgy and saints' lives rendered in verse. But other poetries were flourishing elsewhere. In Persia, where Ferdowsi spent 30 years composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic of 50,000 couplets preserving pre-Islamic Iranian history and mythology, creating a national identity through verse, keeping the Persian language alive when Arabic threatened to replace it. And there was Omar Khayyam, mathematician and astronomer and poet, writing quatrains that pondered fate and pleasure and the mystery of existence, though whether he wrote all the verses attributed to him remains uncertain. His voice, or the voice using his name, spoke of wine and roses and the fleeting nature of life with a melancholy wisdom that would later enchant the Victorian world. In the Arab world, poetry was the supreme art. Pre-Islamic Arabia celebrated its poets as cultural heroes, and the mu'allakat, the suspended poems, were said to have been written in gold and hung in Mecca. 7 odes of such beauty that they became touchstones, establishing meters and themes that would define Arabic verse. The qasida structure moving from nostalgic remembrance to journey to praise. The arrival of Islam brought new purposes to poetry. The Quran itself was considered inimitable, beyond poetry, but shaping all Arabic that came after. And Sufi mystics would use poetry as a vehicle for divine love, for expressing states of ecstasy and union with God, creating a tradition where the beloved addressed in the poem might be human or might be the divine, or both at once. In Japan, the Man-yoshu, or collection of 10,000 leaves, gathered poems from the 7th and 8th centuries. Voices high and low, emperors and peasants and soldiers on the frontier, writing in waka form, 31 syllables arranged in lines of 5-7, 5-7-7, capturing moments of beauty and sorrow with extraordinary compression. This Japanese aesthetic valued suggestion over statement, the importance of what was left unsaid, mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, and poetry became the medium best suited to capturing this, to pointing toward what cannot be directly expressed. By the medieval period in Europe, new forms were emerging, the troubadours of Provence writing in Occitan love songs of courtly devotion, often addressed to unattainable noble ladies, creating an entire vocabulary of longing and service, influencing Dante and Petrarch and the entire trajectory of European love poetry. Dante himself, writing in Italian rather than Latin, made the vernacular respectable for serious poetry. His Divine Comedy, taking the reader through hell and purgatory and paradise, using terza rima, interlocking 3-line stanzas that move forward with inexorable logic, each rhyme pulling the next line along, creating a sense of journey and inevitability. And here was one of poetry's great powers becoming clear: the ability to make systems of belief visible, to give metaphysical concepts concrete images, to let readers walk through the architecture of heaven and hell, to make abstract theology into lived experience through the specificity of verse. Petrarch followed, perfecting the sonnet, that 14-line form that would become perhaps the most influential in Western poetry, writing 366 poems to Laura, exploring love and desire and the passage of time with such psychological nuance that he created a template for introspection, showing how a fixed form could contain infinite variation. In Persia, Hafez was writing ghazals in Shiraz, poems of love and wine and mystical longing, playing with ambiguity, with multiple levels of meaning, his collected works becoming a form of divination. The divan opened at random to seek guidance. his verse so melodious in Persian that it set the standard for what poetry should sound like. And Rumi, writing in the 13th century, producing thousands of verses, his Ma'navi, or spiritual couplets, running to 25,000 lines, teaching through stories and parables, using poetry as a path to truth, to the annihilation of self in divine love, his voice ecstatic and wise, and still speaking across 8 centuries to readers worldwide. The tradition was building layer upon layer, each poet learning from predecessors, sometimes in reverence, sometimes in rebellion, but always in conversation, always adding to the great accumulation of human expression that poetry represented. By the time the Renaissance flowered in Europe, poetry had become inseparable from learning itself, from what it meant to be educated, to be civilized, and the rediscovery of classical texts brought new energy to verse, new models to emulate and transform. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer had already shown what could be done in the vernacular, writing the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, giving each pilgrim a distinct voice, a distinct way of seeing the world, creating characters so vivid they seemed to breathe, and doing it all in rhyme couplets that moved with conversational ease despite their formal structure. The iambic pentameter he helped establish, that 10-syllable line with its da, dum, da, dum, da, dum, da, dum, da, dum rhythm, would become the backbone of English poetry, the line that somehow matched the natural rhythms of English speech while elevating it, making it musical. Then came the 16th century, and with it a cascade of poetic innovation. Sir Thomas Wyatt, bringing the Italian sonnet to England, adapting it, making it speak in English accents, and the Earl of Surrey developing what would become the Shakespearean sonnet form, 3 quatrains and a couplet, a structure perfectly suited to argument and reversal, to building tension and then releasing it in those final 2 lines. Edmund Spenser created his own unique stanza, 9 lines rhyming A, B, B, C, B, C, C, an intricate interlocking pattern he used to construct the Faerie Queene, that vast allegorical romance celebrating Elizabeth and Protestant virtue, showing that poetry could build entire worlds, complete mythologies, sustained across thousands of lines. And then there was Shakespeare, who took the sonnet and made it do some things no one had imagined possible. 154 poems exploring love and time and beauty and mortality with such depth that each one feels like a complete philosophical inquiry compressed into 14 lines. The metaphors startling and precise, the arguments turning on themselves, revealing new facets with each reading. But Shakespeare's dramatic verse might be even more revolutionary, writing plays almost entirely in poetry, in blank verse that could encompass everything from Hamlet's tortured introspection to the earthy jokes of gravediggers, proving that poetry was not just for elevated subjects, that it could contain the full range of human experience, high and low, comic and tragic, all rendered in language that felt both natural and heightened. His contemporaries were no less ambitious. Christopher Marlowe, with his mighty line, Ben Jonson, with his classical precision, John Donne transforming religious devotion and erotic love into metaphysical conceits. Comparisons so elaborate and unexpected they seemed to bend reality, comparing lovers to compasses, death to a short sleep, making the abstract concrete through sheer inventiveness. Donne's holy sonnets wrestled with God, demanding, bargaining, confessing, bringing an almost violent intensity to religious verse. batter my heart. Three-personed God, he wrote, wanting to be broken open, overwhelmed, showing that poetry could be a place of genuine spiritual struggle, not just pious sentiment, in the same period across Europe. Other poets were reaching similar heights. Luis de Góngora, in Spain, creating a Baroque style so ornate and complex it required scholarly annotation, his soledades pushing language to its limits, making syntax twist and fold back on itself, proving that difficulty itself could be a poetic virtue, that poetry didn't have to be immediately accessible to be profound. And there was John Milton, perhaps the last great poet who believed he could explain the ways of God to humankind, spending years preparing to write Paradise Lost, learning languages, studying theology and philosophy, and then, when blindness came, dictating the epic to daughters and assistants, creating blank verse of such muscular complexity that it seemed to contain the weight of all Western learning. His Satan became the most compelling character in the poem, almost against the poet's intention, speaking with such pride and defiance that Romantic poets 2 centuries later would see him as a hero. And perhaps this revealed something about poetry's independence from the poet's conscious purpose, the way a character in verse could take on life, could mean things the author never intended. The 17th century also saw the rise of devotional poetry in English. George Herbert creating pattern poems, shaped like altars and angel wings on the page, exploring Christian faith with a tenderness and humility that balanced Dawn's intensity, showing that simplicity could be as powerful as complexity, that the plain style had its own music. In Japan, Matsuo Basho was transforming haiku from a kind of parlor game into a serious art, traveling through remote provinces with only a pack and a notebook, writing verses that captured the essence of a moment, the old pond and the frog's splash, the silence that follows, teaching that 17 syllables could contain infinity, that poetry didn't need length to have depth. His travel diaries combined prose and verse, creating a new form, the haibun, where poems emerged from narrative like jewels from their settings, and his influence would spread throughout Japan, creating schools and styles that persist to this day. The idea that attention itself, deep noticing, was a form of spiritual practice, and poetry the record of that attention. By the 18th century, poetry in English had achieved a kind of formal perfection. Alexander Pope writing heroic couplets so polished they seemed inevitable. An essay on criticism and the rape of the lock, showing that wit and moral philosophy could be rendered in verse of crystalline clarity, every line balanced, every caesura placed with precision. But this perfection contained the seeds of rebellion. The next generation would react against such control, such artifice. And the Romantic Revolution would explode across Europe like a spring storm after a long winter. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge published Lyrical Ballads in 1798, a collection that announced a new aesthetic. Poetry should use the language really spoken by people, should take as its subjects common life, the rural poor, everyday experiences transfigured by imagination. Wordsworth wrote of daffodils and shepherd boys and a solitary reaper, finding in nature not just pretty scenery, but a living force, a source of spiritual renewal. His autobiographical poem, The Prelude, tracking the growth of a poet's mind across 14 books, showing how childhood experiences in the Lake District shaped his entire vision of the world. Coleridge dreamed the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, a ballad of supernatural terror and redemption, proving that the old forms could still carry new meanings, could be vehicles for psychological exploration. The mariner doomed to repeat his tale, trapped in his guilt, a figure of the modern consciousness, burdened by knowledge it cannot escape. John Keats, dead at 25, left behind odes that seemed to distill beauty into its purest form. Ode to a Grecian urn, ode to a nightingale, ode on melancholy, each one a meditation on art and mortality, on the relationship between the eternal and the fleeting. His language so rich and sensuous you could almost taste it, seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Every word chosen for sound as much as sense. Lord Byron created a persona, the Byronic hero, dark and brooding and irresistible, and wrote verse tales that made him the first literary celebrity. Read across Europe, translated immediately, influencing everyone from Pushkin to Lermontov, showing that poetry could create a public figure, could make the poet himself into a kind of artwork. Percy Bysshe Shelley believed poetry could change the world, could legislate for humanity even if unacknowledged. His defense of poetry arguing that imagination was the root of all moral good, and his own verse ranged from the political anger of the Mask of Anarchy to the sublime abstraction of Mont Blanc, trying always to push language toward the ineffable, toward what could barely be expressed. And there was William Blake, engraving his own illuminated books, combining word and image, creating a private mythology of Los and Urizen and the four Zoas, seeing visions from childhood, claiming to converse with angels, his songs of innocence and experience contrasting two states of the human soul, the lamb and the tiger, the chimney sweeper enslaved and the child on a cloud, showing that poetry could be prophetic, visionary, utterly unique. In America, poetry was finding its own voice. Walt Whitman publishing Leaves of Grass in 1855, a book he would revise and expand for the rest of his life, writing in long free verse lines that broke completely from European models, celebrating democracy and the body and the open road, containing multitudes, contradicting himself, giving America an epic that matched its sprawling landscape and democratic ideals. His contemporary Emily Dickinson worked in the opposite direction, writing in tiny hymn meters, short lines with slant rhymes, almost 1,800 poems found after her death, most unpublished during her lifetime, exploring consciousness and death and immortality with such compression that each poem felt like a metaphysical riddle, a trapdoor opening onto infinity. In France, Charles Baudelaire was transforming poetry with Les Fleurs du Mal, finding beauty in decay, in the urban landscape of Paris, in prostitutes and rag pickers, and the detritus of modern life, creating symbolism, the idea that objects and images could resonate with meanings beyond their literal selves, that poetry could evoke rather than describe, could work through suggestion and association. Arthur Rimbaud, still a teenager, pushed this further, writing A Season in Hell and Illuminations, prose poems that shattered syntax and logic, pursuing a systematic derangement of the senses, trying to make himself a seer through the destruction of ordinary perception, and then abandoning poetry entirely at 20, walking away to become a trader in Africa, leaving behind work that would influence surrealism and modernism decades later. The Russian tradition produced its own giants. Alexander Pushkin creating modern Russian literary language through his verse novel Eugene Onegin, writing in a 14-line stanza, form so flexible it could contain lyric beauty and satirical wit and narrative drive all at once, his influence so profound that Russian poetry is still measured against him. And the symbolist movement spread. Stéphane Mallarmé, writing poems of such musical abstraction, they seemed to approach pure sound, pure idea, believing that poetry should evoke mystery, should work through absence and suggestion. His un coup de dés, a throw of the dice, scattering words across the page in patterns that made typography part of the poem's meaning. The 20th century arrived like a storm, and poetry fractured into 1,000 new directions, each poet seeking a way to speak in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable, where technology and war and psychological discovery had shattered old certainties. Thomas Hardy was still writing in England, his poetry emerging late in life after decades as a novelist, verse marked by loss and regret and a kind of austere honesty about suffering, looking back at the Victorian age from a new century that had no use for Victorian optimism. But the real break came with modernism, with Ezra Pound demanding poets make it new, stripping away Victorian ornament and sentiment, looking back to classical Chinese poetry and medieval Provençal verse for models of compression and precision, imagism, the idea that a poem could present an image so exact that it needed no explanation. In a station of the metro, petals on a wet black bough, 14 words containing an entire aesthetic philosophy. T.S. Eliot published The Waste Land in 1922, a poem that seemed to mirror the fragmentation of post-war Europe, shifting between voices and languages and time periods. Quoting Sanskrit and Shakespeare and music hall songs, creating a collage that required footnotes to decode, showing that poetry could be difficult, could demand work from its readers, and still be essential. The poem opened with April as the cruelest month, reversing Chaucer, suggesting that rebirth was painful, perhaps impossible, and moved through a landscape of spiritual drought, broken images, a heap of broken mirrors, asking what could sustain meaning in a world where the old certainties had died in the trenches of the Great War. William Butler Yeats was pursuing his own transformation, moving from the dreamy Celtic twilight of his early work to something harder and stranger. The Second Coming, imagining a rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem, writing of gyres and historical cycles, of Byzantium and Irish Civil War, creating a personal mythology that somehow spoke to the age's anxiety and violence. His later poetry achieved a kind of magnificent bitterness. An aged man is but a paltry thing, refusing to go gentle, insisting on the body and its demands even as death approached, proving that poetry could grow stronger with age, could find new powers in decline. In America, Wallace Stevens was writing poems that treated poetry itself as subject, the idea of order, the necessary angel, the supreme fiction, working as an insurance executive while composing verse of extraordinary philosophical depth. 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Bird, showing how perspective shapes reality, how imagination creates the world we inhabit. William Carlos. Williams countered the European influence with a determinedly American idiom. No ideas, but in things, he insisted, writing about red wheelbarrows and plums in the iceboxes. finding poetry in the immediate, the local, the everyday object precisely observed, his variable foot trying to capture American speech rhythms in verse form, Marianne Moore created poems from unlikely materials, observations of animals, descriptions of baseball, quotations from scientific journals, all assembled with syllabic precision, her stanzas shaped by count rather than stress, proving that poetry could be made from anything, that the poetic eye could transform any subject. The Harlem Renaissance brought African American voices into the mainstream. Langston Hughes writing in blues rhythms and jazz syncopation, making poetry from black vernacular, celebrating black culture while protesting racism. I, too, sing America, claiming a place at the table that had been denied, showing that poetry could be political without sacrificing art. Claude McKay wrote sonnets of rage and pride. If We Must Die, becoming an anthem of resistance, using the traditional form to speak revolutionary sentiments, and County Cullen explored the double consciousness of being black in America through classical verse forms, the tension between heritage and education, between what he was told to be and what he was. In the Soviet Union, poetry became dangerous. Vladimir Mayakovsky, serving the revolution with his verse, writing propaganda that was somehow also art until disillusionment led to suicide, and Anna Akhmatova survived Stalin's terror, her son imprisoned, her friends executed, writing Requiem as a memorial to all who suffered, poems so dangerous she burned them after memorizing them, trusting friends to hold the lines in memory until it was safe to write them down again. Osip Mandelstam wrote a satirical epigram about Stalin, comparing his fingers to fat grubs, and died in a transit camp, his widow preserving his work by memorization, carrying it through decades of persecution, proving that poetry could matter enough to die for, that it posed a threat to totalitarian power precisely because it insisted on individual voice. On truth-telling, Pablo Neruda in Chile was writing odes to common things, to the onion and the artichoke and salt, elevating the humble through attention and love, his 20 love poems becoming one of the most widely read collections in any language, and his canto general attempting an epic of the Americas, indigenous history and colonial violence and revolutionary hope, all braided together. Federico Garcia Lorca in Spain created a poetry of duende, that dark sound, that awareness of death that makes flamenco and bullfighting and poetry urgent and real, his gypsy ballads mixing folk tradition with surrealist imagery. Before he was shot by fascist forces at the start of the Spanish Civil War, another poet martyred for his art and his politics. The Second World War produced its own poets, Keith Douglas writing from tank battles in North Africa, dying in Normandy at 24, his verse stripped of illusion, seeing war clearly without romanticizing or condemning it, just reporting what he saw with terrible precision. And after the war, after Hiroshima and the Holocaust, poetry had to find ways to continue. Theodor Adorno famously questioned whether poetry was possible after Auschwitz, and Paul Celan answered by writing it anyway, in German, the language of the perpetrators. His death fugue, making music from atrocity, repeating and varying its themes like a Bach fugue. Black milk of daybreak, golden hair and ashen hair, language pushed to its limits to speak the unspeakable. The confessional poets in America made their private lives public, Robert Lowell, writing about mental illness and family history and life studies. Sylvia Plath, transforming personal pain into mythic imagery. Her aerial poems burning with fury and precision, each word chosen to cut, to reveal, to make the internal external. Anne Sexton wrote about subjects that had been taboo: menstruation and abortion and female desire, therapy sessions and suicide attempts, using traditional form, sonnets and ballads, to contain explosive content, showing that the personal could be political, that women's experiences deserved the dignity of art. The beat poets rejected all this. Allen Ginsberg howling against American conformity, writing long Whitman-esque lines that tried to capture spontaneous thought. Jazz improvisation rendered in verse. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, making poetry performance, making it public and urgent and dangerous. Again, in Latin America, poets were experimenting with form and politics. Cesar Vallejo, writing from Peruvian indigenous experience, his trilce fracturing Spanish syntax and grammar to express a vision that couldn't be contained in conventional language, and Octavio Paz exploring surrealism and Mexican identity, writing The Labyrinth of Solitude as both poetry and philosophy, essay and verse blurring together. The Irish tradition continued strong, Seamus Heaney digging with his pen, writing of peat bogs and rural childhood and the troubles in Northern Ireland, making poetry from local materials that somehow became universal, winning the Nobel Prize and proving that regional poetry could speak to the world. Derek Walcott in the Caribbean was creating an epic for the West Indies. Omeros transplanting Homer to the islands, giving voice to a post-colonial experience that honored both African heritage and European education, refusing to choose between them, insisting on complexity and mixture. Elizabeth Bishop traveled constantly, writing postcards from everywhere, her poetry marked by careful observation and emotional restraint. One art, making disaster look easy through a villanelle, the repetition and rhyme containing and controlling loss, showing that form could be feelings opposite and its perfect vessel at once. The Black Arts movement in America insisted on poetry as weapon and tool. Amiri Baraka, writing verse that rejected white aesthetics, that celebrated black power and demanded revolution. Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez making poetry oral again, meant for performance, for the stage and the street corner, not just the page. And women poets were claiming space everywhere. Adrienne Rich transforming from formal poet to feminist revolutionary, her diving into the wreck, exploring what it meant to be a woman writer, to salvage something true from the shipwreck of patriarchal culture. Audre Lorde insisting that the master's tools would never dismantle the master's house, making poetry from rage and love and the intersections of race and gender and sexuality. The late 20th century saw poetry fragment further, language poetry in America, questioning whether meaning itself was possible, using words as materials rather than messages, and new formalism reviving traditional meters and rhymes, insisting that craft still mattered, that innovation didn't require the abandonment of every technique from the past. Poets from formerly colonized nations were writing back to empire, using English transformed by other tongues, other cadences, creating post-colonial poetry that was neither purely indigenous nor purely Western, but something new, something hybrid and powerful. And as the century ended, poetry seemed both more diverse and more marginalized than ever. No longer the central art form it had been when Homer sang or Shakespeare wrote, but still somehow necessary, still being written in every language on earth, still finding readers who needed what only poetry could provide. The voices multiplied, crossing borders and languages, translated and mistranslated and translated again, each poet adding to the garden that now stretched across every continent, every culture, a vast accumulation of human expression in verse, all of it somehow in conversation, Homer still speaking to Walcott, Sappho answering Plath, the dead and the living all present in their words. And standing in this garden now, at the beginning of a new millennium, looking back across 4,000 years or more, the mind begins to wonder what it all means, this persistent human need to shape language into patterns, to make rhythm and image and metaphor, to speak in verse when prose would be easier. Perhaps it begins with breath, with the fact that poetry is tied to the body in ways other writing is not. The line breaks mimicking inhalation and exhalation, the meter echoing the heartbeat, making language physical, making it something felt in the chest and throat before it reaches the mind. The earliest poems were oral, meant to be spoken and heard. And even now, when most poetry is encountered silently on a page, it carries that memory of voice, of breath-shaping sound, of the mouth-forming words that please not just through meaning, but through the sensation of speaking them. The way cellar door is said to be the most beautiful phrase in English, not for what it means, but for how it feels to say it. And there is something about compression, about saying more with less, that seems essential to how humans process experience. We cannot hold everything in consciousness at once, cannot carry the full weight of reality without some way to distill it, to concentrate it. And poetry is perhaps the ultimate distillation, the reduction of complex feeling and thought to its essence. A haiku captures a moment so precisely that the moment expands, becomes infinite. The frog jumping into the pond contains all transience, all the surprise of existence, 17 syllables doing what pages of prose might attempt and fail to achieve. This is why poetry appears in every culture, every language, every era, because the human brain seems to crave pattern and variation, repetition with difference, the comfort of the expected and the pleasure of surprise. Meter giving us the pattern, metaphor providing the surprise. And together they create something that satisfies at levels deeper than the purely rational. Children naturally speak in rhythm, in rhyme, making up nonsense songs before they can construct logical arguments, suggesting that poetry is somehow fundamental to how we acquire and process language, that it comes before prose, before the measured explanations and linear narratives we learn later. And there is the way poetry creates community, the shared knowledge of certain lines, certain poems that bind people together across time and distance. Every English speaker knows to be or not to be. Even if they've never read Hamlet, knows I wandered lonely as a cloud, knows fragments of verse that have become part of the cultural atmosphere we breathe. In oral cultures, this was even more pronounced. Everyone knew the same stories, the same songs, the shared repertoire creating a common ground, a way of understanding the world together, and when a poet performed, the audience could participate, could complete the formulaic phrases, could sing along with familiar passages, making poetry a collective, rather than solitary experience. Even now, even in our fragmented modern world, people memorize poems, carry them internally, whisper lines to themselves in moments of crisis or joy. And this internalization creates an intimacy unlike other art forms. The poem becomes part of your own thought, your own voice, speaking to you in your own mind, with your own accent, but in words someone else chose centuries ago. There is power in this, in the way a dead poet can live inside you, can speak when you need them. Emily Dickinson, writing, "Hope is the thing with feathers," becomes your own hope, becomes the language you use to understand your own emotion, the poet giving you words you didn't have, frameworks you didn't know you needed. And rhythm does something mysterious to memory. Something about the regularity of meter makes words stick. Advertisers know this, using jingles and slogans that lodge in the brain through repetition and rhyme. But poetry uses the same mechanism for deeper purposes, encoding wisdom, warning, celebration, making the memorable more likely to be remembered, passing it forward to the next generation. Perhaps this explains the survival of certain poems across centuries. The ones that endure are not always the most complex or the most profound in their ideas, but the ones whose music is so perfect that they cannot be paraphrased, cannot be said any other way. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The meaning is simple, but the music is irreplaceable. And so it persists. And there is something else, something about poetry's relationship to truth. The way it can be factually, false, but emotionally true, metaphorically accurate, even when literally impossible. Dawn's lovers are not actually a compass, but the comparison reveals something about their relationship that a literal description never could. The metaphor creates a truth that didn't exist before the poem made it. This is why poetry is dangerous to authoritarian regimes, why dictators imprison poets, why verses can start revolutions, because poetry makes claims that cannot be fact-checked, operates at levels of meaning that evade simple yes or no verification. It slips past the censors by working through suggestion and image, through meanings that resonate rather than meanings that can be pinned down. And in personal life, but poetry gives us language for what resists language, for grief and love and wonder and terror, the states where ordinary speech fails, where we stammer and fall silent. The poet has already been there, has found words for the wordless, and offers them to us like gifts, like tools we can use to shape our own experiences. The garden stretches on, infinitely various, and yet there are common themes that appear again and again across cultures and centuries. The Carpe Diem poems urging us to seize the day because time is short. The Obads marking lovers' reluctant partings at dawn. The Elegies mourning the dead. The Odes celebrating beauty or truth or a Grecian urn. These recurrent forms suggest that certain human experiences are universal, that a Chinese poet in the 8th century and an Irish poet in the 20th might both write about exile, about longing for home, and their poems might speak to each other across the gap of language and time, might reveal that consciousness, for all its particularity, shares certain contours, certain concerns that transcend the individual. And standing here at the edge of the garden as twilight deepens, watching the last light fade from the paths where the poets walk, there is a sense of gratitude for all these voices, all these attempts to capture the uncapturable, to make the invisible visible through arrangement of words on a page or in the air. The garden grows quieter now, the voices becoming whispers, becoming echoes, and the mind drifts among them without urgency, without the need to choose or compare or rank, simply moving from one voice to another, listening to the music each one makes, the particular rhythm and diction that marks each poet as themselves. Homer is still singing somewhere in the dusk, his long lines rolling like waves, and Sappho's fragments still burn bright, brief flames in the gathering dark. Dante walks through his three realms, forever ascending, and Milton's blank verse still wrestles with paradise and its loss. The romantics wander among the trees, words worth finding intimations of immortality in the evening light. Keats, listening to a nightingale that is every nightingale, singing of summer in full-throated ease, and Byron broods magnificently while Shelley chases visions only he can see. Dickinson moves quietly in her corner, tending her private garden of death and eternity, while Whitman sprawls on the grass nearby, containing multitudes, celebrating the body electric, the two of them opposite and complementary, the compressed and the expansive, the hidden and the public, both American, both essential. The moderns have built their fragmentary monuments. Eliot's wasteland still waiting for rain. Pound's cantos still trying to include history, and Stevens still meditating on the imagination's supreme fictions, while Williams finds infinity in the local, in the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater, and the voices continue, beyond counting, beyond cataloging, each one adding something irreplaceable to the vast conversation, the poets dead and living all speaking at once, their words overlapping and harmonizing and contradicting and completing each other, creating a chorus that has been singing since language began and will continue as long as humans draw breath and arrange it into patterns. The light is nearly gone now, the garden dissolving into darkness, but the voices remain, disembodied, pure sound and sense floating in the night air. And it doesn't matter that most of these poets never met, never knew each other's work, because the poems themselves create the connections, build bridges across the chasms of time and space and death. This is the miracle of poetry, that it defeats time, that Sappho still speaks, though her civilization is dust, that Homer still sings though we don't even know if he existed, that words carefully chosen and arranged can outlast empires, can survive the languages they were written in, can be translated and transformed, and still carry something essential, still move readers millennia after the hand that wrote them return to earth. And so the garden persists, adding new voices, new visions, never complete, never finished, always growing, a living tradition that requires only attention and memory, readers willing to listen, willing to carry the words forward, willing to let dead poets live again in their minds and hearts. The paths grow dim, the figures fade, but the words remain, suspended in the air like stars, points of light in the darkness, each one a human voice reaching across the void, saying, I was here, I saw this, I felt this, and hoping someone, someday, somewhere, would hear and understand and answer. And perhaps that is what poetry finally is. Not the garden or the voices or the forms or the traditions, but the reaching, the attempt to connect, to bridge the fundamental loneliness of consciousness, to say what cannot be said and have someone else recognize it anyway, to make music from breath and meaning, from sound and beauty, from the strange fact of being alive and aware in an improbable universe. The night deepens, the garden becomes invisible, but the words still whisper in the darkness, still sing their ancient songs, still offer what they have always offered: companionship, beauty, truth, the accumulated wisdom and wonder of 4,000 years of human beings trying to speak what is deepest in them, trying to leave something behind that matters, that lasts, that might comfort or challenge or change someone they will never meet. And in the silence that follows, in the pause between one breath and the next, there is only gratitude for all of it, for every line ever written, every metaphor ever made, every rhyme and rhythm and image, the whole vast, gorgeous, impossible accumulation of poetry, still here, still speaking, still alive in anyone who takes the time to listen. The voices fade to whispers, the whispers fade to silence, and in that silence there is peace, the deep quiet that comes after great music, after the last note has been played and still hangs in the air, vibrating, slowly diminishing, but never quite disappearing, never entirely gone.